The views and opinions of the guests of Veterans Archives do not reflect the views and opinions of Veterans Archives, its subsidiaries, or its partners. Hello and welcome to Veterans Archives. This is a podcast where you can learn about our military history in the words and voices of the men and women who lived and created it. I'm your host, Bill Krieger, and let's listen to our next story. Today is Friday, March 31st, 2023. I am talking with Michael Galoucis, U.S. Army, retired. We're just going to start from the very beginning and talk about when and where you were born.
I was born in Quincy, Massachusetts. It's right outside of Boston. It's about 7 miles. You can see Boston from Quincy in most places. And it's famous for being the city of presidents. Both John Adams and his son, John Quincy Adams, were both born in Quincy. It's the only city in the country where two presidents are from. And it's also the former home of both Gordon Sullivan, who was the chief of staff of the Army at one point in history, as well as the current chief of staff of the Army, Jimmy McGonigal. So it's kind of a historic town. That's where I was born.
Well, I guess, did you have aspirations of becoming president at any point in your childhood?
Not at all. Not once. And those aspirations have never changed over the years.
I'm assuming they probably disappeared even more after the past few years.
Exactly.
Well, good. So let's talk a little bit about young Mike. Did you have brothers and sisters?
I did. I was the middle son. We had three boys. And my parents were both from Massachusetts and from Boston. They both were born and raised within the city of Boston. My mom's parents were Irish lineage from the old country. And her maiden name was O'Loughlin, with an O, with an apostrophe. And her family was from Clare County, Ireland. And my dad's mom and dad were both born in Greece. So it's kind of an unusual, when they married, it was not common for someone with Greek heritage marrying someone from Irish heritage. And my mom is deceased now, but she used to tell the story sort of with a tongue in cheek that she was required to go to Greek school to learn the language, you know.
Yes, and anyone who's Greek would know all about Greek school for sure.
That's right. But I did. I was the middle one. I had an older brother who was a couple of years older than me. He still lives in Massachusetts, right outside. In fact, he lives in Quincy. And my younger brother lives and has lived for many years since graduate school in Chicago. There's about right around 2 years difference between all of us.
It must have been really busy in your household with three boys that close together.
It was. We look at our mom and my dad, obviously both of them, with the highest respect. They were great parents. But, you know, my dad, we grew up pretty much in the 60s and 70s. And at that point in history, my mom, who was a registered nurse, she was not working all the time. She made it a point. They agreed that she wouldn't work until we were old enough where she felt comfortable doing that. So I don't think she started working again until I was probably in 8th grade. My dad was gone a lot. He worked a lot of different hours. So my mom raised us, and she was a saint because, as you allude to, you know, raising three boys that are that close together, particularly once we hit puberty, it was pretty tough. But we were good kids, really, overall. None of us really got into any mischief. We played sports and, just the normal challenges of raising three boys, but nothing really out of the ordinary.
So it sounds like a lot of fun, but if I could just pin it down and say, hey, Mike, tell me like one of your favorite childhood memories. What do you think that would be?
Ah, man, that's a tough one because I have so many great memories. One of the I'd say I'm going to give you two answers to that. You asked for one. It's hard to give one. One of the things we always looked forward to is my mom had a brother who lived in Indiana, right near where Notre Dame, University of Notre Dame is. So, and my dad had a sister. My dad had three sisters, and one of them lived in Richmond, Indiana. So one of the things as a kid that we really looked forward to, all of us, was making that trek out to Indiana, which we used to do about every other year. And we would first go to Notre Dame, not Notre Dame, but to South Bend, and spend some time with that uncle and his wife and his kids. And then after about 5 days there, we would travel down south to Richmond, which is right on the Ohio border, sort of eastern Ohio, right across the border, from Ohio. And they had three brothers. So, that Aunt Stell, she had three sons. And so that was our first cousins. And it was just so different than the metropolitan Boston area. It was we ended up living in Hull. I was born in Quincy, but we lived in Hyde Park for a while, which is within Boston proper. And then eventually we moved to Hull, which is a beach town on the south shore of Boston. And, going out to Indiana and the rural parts, particularly South Bend and New Carlisle, Indiana, where we would visit, so different than what we were accustomed. So and those were always just great memories, driving out there. We would drive, we didn't fly. We drove, 5 people in the car. So that was a great memory. And then I'd say the other one was really just, probably the athletics in high school. I played football, I played basketball, played other sports as a kid, but, it ended up really basketball was my main sport. And just, making a team. I don't know how it is today, but back in those days, you tried out, particularly for basketball, and there would be probably 50 people trying out to make the basketball team. And typically only, 12, 13 kids made the team. And so looking at the list, whether or not your name was on there, was kind of sort of a seminal event in your life at that point in history. It was a big deal. So I'd say probably some of those. And we just had a great family. I had not only my own immediate family, but my extended family. I was really close to my aunts and uncles and cousins. I always felt like I was closer to some of my aunts and uncles, and some people were, some of my buddies were to their own parents. That's so it was that close knit European, ancestry and all that stuff. So lots of good memories though. Growing up, really, really had a lot of good memories.
Now, were all three of you athletic?
My older brother played track. That was his, in high school, he was a track guy. My younger brother played football and track, and he was definitely the better football player and the best football player in the family. I was, I think as a senior in high school, I was like 6'2", 182. I was a lean, mean fight machine, was in great shape physically and, had a lot of conditioning, but, wasn't that later on in life, I got into weights, more lifting weights and things of that nature. But back then, I was just, in shape. I knew the game. I loved the game. My brother really got into the weights heavy, my younger brother in high school. And he was a fullback and a linebacker, and he was a pretty solid kid, So athletics was important in our family, but I'll tell you, my dad, the big thing was emphasis, my mom and dad was on education and doing well academically. And that was always a risk, how's my report card? Because, you had to be real bad student for your school not to let you play, to be ineligible. That we never got to that level. But to meet my father and mother's standards, that was a different standard. That was a higher standard, So I remember actually trying out for basketball one year, and we hadn't got our report card yet. And I was kind of like, sneaky almost, because I wasn't sure that my parents were going to be pleased with my report card. I mean, they pretty much wanted you to make the honor roll all the time, which we didn't do, which I didn't do all the time. But, they would allow some variance from that for the really difficult topics. But it was interesting.
Yeah. Well, I think it's good that parents have a higher standard than the school. Absolutely. Sometimes. It drives you to be a better student. So you make it through high school. What happened at graduation?
Well, one of the things, and the tie to the military that I owe it to you to share with you and your audience is that, so when I was growing up, all of the men that I respected, which is not to say I didn't respect women, but they had not served, right? Think about the time frame that I'm talking about, growing up in the 60s and the early 70s. All of the men that I respected, which started with my own dad and my uncles and my high school basketball coach, for example, and I'll come back to him probably later in response to a question. So my older cousins, I had some cousins that were much older than me, first cousins that were probably 15 years older than me. Like when I was in grade school, they were already, 22 out. They all had served in the military. Every one of them. I mean, you'd go to one of the aunt's house, and there's the picture of, Uncle Bob in the Army. There's your picture of Uncle Fred, in the Army. There's your picture of this, So I kind of always knew I was going to come in the military. I didn't know when, what service exactly, or how that was going to come about. As I neared the end of high school, I was a young senior in high school. I just turned 17 in March of my senior year. So when you think about that, still very immature in a lot of different ways, physically, emotionally, mentally, everything. And I had strict parents, and one of my dear friends also had strict parents. A lot of the other kids I hung around with just didn't have that control, strong, environment at home. So me and this other buddy really thought seriously about joining the Marine Corps together as an enlisted man right out of high school,
Right.
Part of that was we wanted to, we were at that stage in life. We wanted to fly, what's the saying,
spread your wings and fly.
Spread your wings and fly. Exactly. It's like a song. So we wanted to leave just to get away. We both loved our parents. There was no issues on the home front, but we were just ready. We had been under control like that for so long. We really were looking forward to leaving. And the Marines were, appealing to us because of the uniform and there's such a strong, they've always had great ads, recruiting ads, so the whole thing came together. We thought about doing that very seriously. They had a buddy system that was very attractive, which would pretty much guarantee you would go to basic together, you would go to MOS school together. And my recollection, I could be wrong, my recollection was they even guaranteed your first assignment together. And by the time you did all that, you were pretty much almost done with your 4-year commitment, So it was very appealing. But what was interesting was I had not talked to my parents. That was the weird thing. I really hadn't shared with them. I was really thinking about joining the Marine Corps. And at one point in the recruiting process, the recruiter told me, hey, you got a problem, and of course my reaction, what, did I flunk those tests that I kind of zipped through? Oh, no. You're only 17. And I said, yes. I mean, I was honest in the application. Well, you need parental consent, and I had not discussed it. So of course, if I knew then what I knew probably a year later, I would have gone out for lunch and, come back and just sign the thing myself, because that recruiter's just trying to make the mission, as they always are, right?
Right.
But I kind of looked at it. I've always been somewhat spiritual. I get that from my mom, probably more than my dad. And I kind of was like, man, maybe this is a godsend. Maybe I'm getting a signal here. So I talked about it, and initially talked about it with my mom, because she was always home typically. And she said, well, let's see what Dad says. So I talked to my dad. I remember like it was yesterday. My dad was like, who had been now keep in mind, my dad had been a former NCO in the Army. My dad was like, oh, yeah, you want to join the Marine Corps? Yeah, I get it. I understand, yeah. And you can do that. And then there's this long pregnant pause. And it was like, when you're 18,
right.
Because son, I want you to go to college. So needless to say, long story short is, did not join the Marine Corps. My buddy did. And he served 4 years. Of course, about 3 months afterwards, I was getting, letters. That was back in the old snail mail days, right? No email, no cell phones. He was writing back to me these barely legible, from Paris Island, hey, this sucks. So he was almost, jealous that I didn't go in, but he ended up serving 4 years and did his time. I respect that, did a tour down in Okinawa. So meanwhile, I go to college and I take ROTC, and I go to summer camp after my sophomore year in college, which was essentially basic training at Fort Knox, Kentucky. Almost all NCOs were the cadre. There was a captain, company commander who would come out, salute the flag. They'd turn the unit over to him. They'd do reveille and all that. But, he was a non-factor in our training. No impact at all whatsoever. And I think I don't even know that I ever shook the man's hand or met him. But you really had the NCOs. We had a platoon sergeant. We were blessed. We had Vietnam-era senior NCOs, E7s, E8s, as platoon sergeants, which is not common. And then there was, each company had one sergeant major, So my formative years in basic was all non-commissioned officers, which is not that unique really when you go even today. Base training is mostly non-commissioned officers. But that was an incredible experience. It was hot. I remember being hot as a son of a gun at Fort Knox. I literally remember these were the old fatigues. And I remember one day listening to a drill sergeant, and we were on a hot pavement. I had the old fatigues on, and I remember smelling. I was on my knees, one of my knees, like kind of, on my. And I remember something's burning. Something's, and I was like, "What the hell is it?" And what it was my pants were burning. My pants literally were smoldering from the heat. I'm not making this up. And that was just illustrative how, how hot it was. It was the hottest I'd been up until that point in my life, but that changes over time as I go to other places in the military, But right. That was great. Then I went to Fort Bragg after my junior year in college, and that was what they call ROTC Advanced Camp. And that was, also primarily, although we had a few officers, mostly non-commissioned officers. And then, of course, by the time I was a senior, I got commissioned in June of my senior year in college. And at that point in life, this was 1980, I got commissioned on the top deck of the USS Constitution in Charlestown Harbor. So it's the oldest vessel in the United States military. And it's always been very well maintained. And it was kind of ironic because Army ROTC, but we're getting commissioned on the deck of a Navy vessel, Right. But all of us, we're from the Boston area, and we knew how historic, how special that was. And I came in the Army, so I got commissioned in June of 80, and my thoughts were out. My mantra at that point, out the door in 84. I was not going to. I had no. I don't think you come in the military with this thought that you're going to serve a long career. I right. liked the military. I did not reflect at all my disdain for. I mean, I really was proud to be commissioned and really happy to be an officer. But I just didn't think I was going to do it for long. So here I am, and I volunteered for Germany. That was at the point in life where, hey, join the military, see the world. I was a single guy, so I volunteered for Germany. And that's where I was assigned as my first assignment. And I first went to the officer basic course. I was commissioned a military police officer, which was exactly what I requested, based on majoring in criminal justice. I really had a goal at that point in life to be an FBI agent. So my goal in life changed at one point to Marine Corps for 4 years, be a Massachusetts State Trooper. That was, when I was 17, that's what I wanted to do. When I went to college, my goal was to be an FBI agent, and at the time, they were not really hiring people with just criminal justice background, and just college, and so I was encouraged even relatively early in college to, hey, we're probably not going to hire you right out of college. Do something else, go to law school, get an MBA, or better yet, go in the military, So I went in and first assignment was Germany. So Germany, I get to Germany, and in the MP Corps, there's kind of 4 specific ways you can go, right? One is sort of what most people would refer to as law enforcement, traditional law enforcement. In the military, most of the installations of the military are sort of like a community, So you have police. And in those times, most of those police, it's evolved, and we can talk about that later. But, at that point in history, the police officers on an Army installation at least, were United States military police. So that was one track. Another track you could do was sort of the corrections track. The Army at that time in history had several regional correction facilities. So you could, get training and experience in corrections, if that was something you were interested in. The other track was sort of more the traditional sort of combat support role of the military police corps, which in that role is not that different from the cavalry or something. It's a pretty heavily armed unit. You're outside the wire. You're doing combat operations, battlefield circulation control, area security, so and enemy prison of war operations would be part of that. And then the other track that at that point in history was more prevalent than it is today, and really more prevalent than it was during even the latter part of my career, was physical security. So I just try to take you in the audience to Europe in the early 80s. We still had nuclear weapons over there, right. Pershing weapons, artillery type weapons. We also had air defense artillery, nuclear capable weapons, which was the Nike Hercules system. And so I was happy as heck with my mom. I came home one day, that summer after being commissioned, and I was handed, the big Army envelope, and it was orders to Germany. And I was excited, So when I went to the Office of Basic, I still had not received the pinpoint. It was just telling me, hey, you are going to Germany. Then when I got to the Officer Basic course at Fort McClellan, Alabama, I eventually got my pinpoint assignment. And that pinpoint assignment was to a Nike Hercules air defense battery. Now, I would just tell you that was not a choice assignment. Most guys, my contemporaries, like, oh, God, who did you piss off, Because that was not the coveted assignment. Because you're really not in an MP unit, you're in an air defense. So I was assigned to an air defense battery, which was part of an air defense battalion, which was part of an air defense brigade, essentially, which was part of the 32nd Army Air Defense Command. So you were an MP lieutenant, and there was no MPs up, you were working. So I think for that reason, it was tough. And the duty was tough, in the sense that right. People were working 12-hour shifts. You had high security towers, the perimeter fencing, and your whole mission was to protect the nuclear capable components that were on your site. Tough duty, and in the same way that most of the officers that had that duty were not enamored with it, so was true for the enlisted soldiers that were there. They were not enamored. So it was a challenge. Now, the good news, and this is always, hindsight is always 20/20, but I learned this even while I was there. I started to have this appreciation, was you really learned a lot about leadership. It was a great leadership lab. I remember when I finally got to it, that site eventually closed. They inactivated the site, and I still had time left on my tour in Europe. So I was basically allowed, I was like a free agent. I felt like a professional athlete, even though I wasn't even near a professional. But I was allowed to go out and find myself a job, essentially. Mm-hmm. So because I was there like 28 months, I think, as a platoon leader, but I had 8 more months to serve, as a minimum, 8 more months to fulfill my 36-year overseas obligation. So I was traveling around Germany by train and interviewing with battalion commanders to see, if they could use someone, at that point, kind of a mid-level first lieutenant. I'd already been promoted first lieutenant. Right. And I remember going to the unit that I eventually was assigned to was the 95th MP Battalion in Mannheim, which turned out to be a great assignment because it was relatively close to, it was the nearest MP battalion to where I had been assigned, so I could still associate with some of my friends in that area, both German and Americans. And I remember interviewing with the XO of the battalion, a major, and, he asked me, did I have any preference? He kind of he was trying to get a feel for who I was. I'd never met him. I'm still close to him to this day, by the way, and he's a retired colonel. But he was like, well, if we were able to accept you here in this battalion, do you have a preference? And I remember telling him, and it shows you how, sophomoric I was at that stage of life. I said, well, sir, I'd prefer to go to Kaiserslautern, which was one of their companies. He goes, well, why do you want to go there? And I said, they have a good gym, and he was like, well, thanks, Mike. I don't think we're going to consider that in the determination. But I ended up going there, and I worked in a combat support MP company. And the tie into my first unit and the leadership, the whole thing was, I remember going to my first meeting at that battalion headquarters with all the other platoon leaders. And I was a new guy, even though I was the first lieutenant. I was senior than many of them, but I was the new guy in the battalion. So everyone's looking around, who is this guy, And I remember listening to the types of things they were complaining about. Well, everybody complains, right? Everybody's griping about something or another. It wouldn't be the military if they weren't. And I remember thinking to myself, man, if this is all these guys are complaining about, this is going to be an easy tour. And in fact, that year I was fortunate to have an opportunity to serve another year as a platoon leader there. So I ended up with well over 3 years as a platoon leader. Great foundation to my career. I remember that was the easiest year of my life. I mean, it was literally the easiest year of my Army career compared to what I had experienced and what I would eventually experience. The other real positive part of that is I had great leadership role models in my company commander, a guy named Bruce Ulrichsen, who I'm still friends with to this day, decades later. That kind of speaks to the friendship. He was a former Green Beret who had served 2 tours in Vietnam as an enlisted man, so what a great person to have as a company commander, a combat veteran. He was motivated. He was just a great leader. I mean, I can't say enough good things about Bruce. I could take the whole show talking about, how good a leader he was. And then my battalion commander was an MP Lieutenant Colonel named Bob Walters Sr. He is since passed away. He was also an enlisted Special Forces guy. And Bob Walters truly was one of the best leaders I ever served with. Just real quickly about him, right? He served 2 tours in Vietnam as an enlisted Green Beret. He served 1 tour in Vietnam as a warrant officer helicopter pilot. And he served 1 tour in Vietnam as an infantry company commander. I mean, he did 4 tours in Nam and 1 as a Green Beret, a couple as a Green Beret, couple as a helicopter pilot, and then as an infantry officer. And so the experiences he brought, and to have, as a still young first lieutenant with 3+ years in the Army, and these are my 2 senior leaders, my company commander, my battalion, and we were right next to battalion headquarters, so I saw my battalion commander all the time. And
so that was kind of an amazing part about being in the military in that 80s time frame, was that you still had the people that had combat experience.
Absolutely.
And they were in senior leadership roles.
Oh, it was incredible. I mean, to have, I'm serious. I mean, the things I learned, I'm going to give you one quick vignette, what I learned from my battalion commander. So I'm a motivated platoon leader, right? And we have an external evaluation, what they call an ex-eval. Mm-hmm. And it's in Hammelburg, which is the home of the German infantry school, or at least it was at that time in history. So we're doing, some of the members of my company were road marching down there in vehicles, from Mannheim to Hammelburg, which was a pretty, probably 250, 300 kilometers. It was not an insignificant, convoy. Because of my relationships with aviators out at Coleman Barracks in another part of Mannheim, I was able to get my platoon airlifted by Chinooks from Mannheim to Hammelburg. So we put our Jeeps. This is back in the days with literally, the 1/4-ton Jeeps, with the machine gun mounts on top. We flew in to Hammelburg. I think we had 5 or 6 Chinooks, Mm-hmm. So the battalion commander, who was a very active battalion commander, I mean, he really took seriously the responsibility that was his job more than the company commander to train the lieutenants, because he was our senior rater. He wrote, was a key input on our report card. So I remember him coming to the day before we rolled out to load up the Chinooks and fly down to Hammelburg. I did my final operations order brief to my platoon. And without me knowing it, until I saw him, my battalion commander decided to participate or observe that briefing. So he observes that briefing, leaves just before it's done. I don't, whatever. He was there. I didn't change my presentation. I recognized him. Sir, do you want to say it? No, yep, continue, So anyway, I thought I had a pretty good plan. Fast forward to the next day, I'm in the lead Chinook, and we're hovering over a large open field that I had briefed my people. This is how we're going to land. This is what we're going to do initially when we get there, blah, blah, blah. And I'm on the headsets with the pilot, and I know map where we're supposed to land, and the guy flies right over where we're supposed to land. So I'm literally right behind the pilot. I'm tapping him on the shoulder and talking to the headset. Hey, what's going on? I figured maybe he saw, maybe he's just going to do a loop around. That wouldn't have been that uncommon. We weren't under fire,
Right.
He just keeps on going. Doesn't even acknowledge, he's like a W3 or 4. He just keeps on going. Eventually puts the birds down, probably a 1/4 of a mile, forward of where I had briefed my op order. This is probably at 5 PM. It's just starting the sun's going down. And we get hit with NBC attack, nuclear, simulated
right.
smoke. And the long story short, it was a cluster, total. My plan, my quote, perfect plan was totally, and I'm stressed because I've got my mop gear on, all my gear on. It's hot. I'm trying to gain some semblance of control of my platoon and get us, to where we need to be. We're fending off like small arms fire, and we finally, I finally figured out with the advice of my platoon sergeant on the NCOs, we get to our destination, So it finally we're given all clear. We take off stuff, and I'm just sitting there. I think I'm having a cup of coffee or something, and it, soaked. I'm pissed. And who walks in? My battalion commander. He puts his arm around me. Michael, how are you doing? And I was like, sir, not worth a damn, really. Why is that? And of course I'm not aware of what's transpiring. Why is that? Well, sir, honestly, you saw my op board yesterday. I thought I had a pretty good plan. The plan I had totally went to, crap. Well, how did that happen? I said, well, the damn pilots didn't land where, and then I start to see this gradual smile. And he says, so, okay, what did you learn from this? Did you learn anything? And literally I say, well, yes, sir. I guess in assessing what transpired, I thought I had a pretty good plan, but, plans are only as good, as the first point of contact, the first enemy contact, whatever. And he goes, yeah. Then he finally went into the mentoring mode. He goes, yeah, Mike, I sat on your op order, as you brief. He said, you had a great plan, but you know what? You didn't have a plan B. You didn't have a backup plan. And I made sure who do you think told that pilot not to fly, and then it all kind of came together for me. And I was pissed,
went on.
I was humbled and I was pissed, but very quickly after, almost minutes after, I realized I had just been shot through the forehead with a silver bullet in terms of the valuable lesson I had been taught as a first lieutenant, that everything you do, particularly if it's in a combat environment or a simulated, no matter what it is, you have to have a backup plan, because your plan typically has been designed and developed in a very ideal, benign situation, but it's typically going to be carried out in something other than that, And I'm going to tell you, that might be the most valuable lesson I was ever taught in my military career. And the artful way that he conveyed that, it wasn't just verbalizing something to me. He made me feel humbled and disoriented and disorganized. And, so it was, like I say, it was probably the most valuable lesson. But that just speaks to the quality of my battalion commander, and my company commander was just as strong a leader as him. So I was blessed at that time in life to have that group, and I ended up staying. I volunteered to extend one more year. I was a single guy in Germany. I was having a ball, if that's time in life, you're soldiering, a lot of soldiering. You got cars, German cars. There's no speed limit on the Autobahn. Good German beer. There was no I was not in any big hurry to get back to the States. So I ended up staying another year, served 4 years in Germany as my first assignment.
And, not only did you obviously work hard and play hard, but what I'm hearing is all of these great lessons you learned along the way from these people who probably had their plans shot up a few times in their experience.
Oh yeah. Well, my company commander, battalion commander, like I say, they were combat veterans from Vietnam. Both had the combat infantry badge. Yeah, they definitely had experienced combat, and they learned a lot, and that was their way of conveying it to me. The other thing that really helped me in Germany, so that extra year that I stayed, I eventually got to the point where I was promoted to captain, and you can't be a platoon leader as a captain because your company commander is a captain, So I was moved up to the battalion staff to be the assistant S3 operations officer. And, at that point in life, having just come from a platoon, I was kind of naive and immature in the sense that, to me, you were either this or you were that. In other words, you were either a fully versatile, all-around great soldier. So you were fit, you were competent, you were tough, all these attributes. And if you weren't all those things, something was wrong with you. And I didn't really respect you at that young age in my military career. So when I got to battalion headquarters, one of the guys that was up there was a master sergeant. There was a sergeant major that was the senior NCO in the section, but the section was also authorized, an MP battalion at that point in history was also authorized a master sergeant. And when I looked at that master sergeant, he was overweight. He was broke physically. He couldn't do PT with the unit anymore, physical training. There was a lot of things that were wrong with him. And under the way I had been sort of conditioned prior to that point in my career, like, this guy is useless. Why is he still in the Army? And again, lesson learned, right? This NCO, his name was Fauver, F-A-U-V-E-R. I forget his first name. Master Fauver was one of the smartest men and soldiers I had met in the Army up until that point in my career. Also a combat veteran, and he was really a bright guy and taught me how to be a staff officer. So, in your career, at least as an Army officer, you're only going to have the privilege, if you have that privilege, of leading soldiers probably 45, 50% of your career. The other 45, 55, 60% of your career is going to be staff. At different levels, battalion, brigade, division, corps, headquarters, major command. And the guy unequivocally who taught me how to be a staff officer was a master sergeant, non-commissioned officer. And I learned a tremendous amount. And I don't even want to go into detail how he did, but just literally foot locker coaching. Put his arm around me. Hey, sir, you got to write an op, or let me help you kind of think through just a superb teacher, So when I came back from Germany, I felt blessed, and I really did. Even then, I felt blessed to know that I had worked for I had some of the best junior leaders, battalion commander and company commander, and then some of the best non-commissioned officers around me. And just to go back, digress a minute to my first assignment, they were all air defense officers, didn't have an MP in my chain, but I served with some incredible air defense officers, battalion executive officer Johnny Shaw, the battalion commander Bill Aarons. These were, great leaders, integrity, competence, loyal, really taught you how to be an officer. So, and then great similar experience with the MPs. So, but when I came back from Germany to go to the, what initially was projected to be the captain's career course, I'll digress. I'll tell that story too in a minute. But it was, I really felt blessed. I felt like, hey, I really got my bang for my buck out of that 4 years in Germany.
Something that you mentioned too was the mentorship that you received from your senior NCO, from the master sergeant. It reminds me when I was a fresh lieutenant. Now I was enlisted prior to becoming an officer, but I still had a lot to learn. But as a fresh lieutenant and platoon leader, I had Sergeant First Class Lucas. I'll never forget him. And anytime I was about to say or do something stupid, he would just say, "Hey, sir, is that really what you want to do?" And it was his way of saying, we need to have a conversation, not in front of the troops. And man, I learned so much from him. And it just sounds like a very similar situation. Like those NCOs, if you treat them right, they will give you all of their knowledge.
Well, I think what you're saying, Bill, is absolutely spot on. The awkwardness that some people don't ever get. I think I was partially blessed that my dad had been an NCO, so he talked to me a little bit about the differences with officers and NCOs and how to build that relationship. I think how you interact with NCOs and what respect you show them really has a lot to do with what respect they'll show you. Because, you think about the dynamic, right? You come in, you're a second lieutenant. You're in charge of the platoon. Yeah, you're in charge. Literally, you're in charge maybe. But your platoon sergeant has 15 years in the Army. So let's get this straight. He was in the Army as a soldier when you were 7 years old in third grade, So if you, to me, and I've seen this as I've progressed in rank and had the privilege of commanding at different levels, if you treat your NCOs with that respect, commensurate with their service and their past experience, they will give it back to you in spades, and they will take you under their, and you'll be their lieutenant, their captain, their major, their lieutenant, whatever, right? They'll take pride in you, and they'll know that how you perform is also a reflection of them. If you come in there and say, look, I'm in charge, this is what we're going to do, what my experience has been is they'll say, oh, hey, sir. And then they'll revert to that role of essentially only doing what you tell them to do. And of course, for at least the first 10 years, you don't know what right looks like. So what you tell them to do is probably not right. Now, they won't let you totally screw up or harm the soldiers. They'll take steps to preclude, but they will definitely let you as the commander or as the leader fall flat in your face if you don't give them that respect without question,
Yeah, they'll let you be in charge. They'll let you be in charge if you want to be in charge.
Yeah, that's right. And that's really a pattern my whole life. And my thing very early on was sort of understanding that, because you can get carried away with the term commander. I'm a commander, Well, someone, I don't even remember when, but it was probably, I don't even know if it was just talking to me or it was part of a group that I listened to. But it's kind of like, this isn't your platoon. You just happen to be the platoon leader. This is no more your platoon than that E4 who's in the platoon, Creighton Abrams, the former Army Chief of Staff, who was a hero in World War II, is a tank commander. He had a line that I learned at one point was telling soldiers, you are not in the Army, you are the Army, and that distinction there, And I learned that at a pretty early age, and it really made things, I don't want to say it made it easier, but it was more shared ownership, and get those NCOs involved, delegate, give them responsibility, So I started probably as a young, when I was, let me give you so I go back to the captain's career course.
Right.
From McClellan, Alabama. And I have a little bit of time. I'm there a little bit early before the course starts. And I'm just walking around. This is where I was as a lieutenant. I had done 4 years in Germany, so I kind of felt, like, hey, I'm a different person now than I was when I was here 4 years ago. Just walking around the schoolhouse, and I went over to a part of the schoolhouse I had never been to when I was there as a lieutenant, which was called the Directorate of Combat Development, DCD. I had no idea what they did. I knew the building was there. I never went in it. There was no need to go in. I was walking over there one day, just killing time, really, looking around. And the colonel came down the stairs. I never met the guy, but his office was actually upstairs, the full colonel that ran the place. And he comes down and can I help you? I guess I looked like I was lost, Can I help you, Captain? You looking for anyone in particular? No, not really, sir. I'm here, to go to the course, but never been in this building before. And he said, well, what are you doing right now? It was about 11:20 in the afternoon. Well, nothing really, sir. Come on, why don't you come out to lunch with me? So I go out to lunch with this guy, and while I'm out to lunch with him, his name is Lucy, Lucy, Dan Lucy, Colonel, good guy, very unpretentious, warm. And he's like, well, tell me about, so at lunch, we're going out for a sandwich. I mean, you're like, where, who are you? Where have you been? So I told him, so what was interesting to him was I had been at a nuclear security site performing the duties of platoon leader. And he really fixated on that for a little bit. And he said, well, and I didn't really know. He asked me a lot of questions. Then, like before we went separate ways, we go back. He says, hey, you do whatever you think is right, but we've got a project that we're doing here, and I'd love to have a guy like you come and work with us. And I said, well, sir, can you tell me about it? He goes, well, yeah, long and short of it is we are changing. We're in the process of going through the sort of the institutional changes required to update our security, our MP security company. And I think most of the guys we have no experience in that, and a guy like yourself who had over 2 years experience on a nuclear capable site, I think we can utilize the experience. So that's what I ended up doing. I called my branch and I said, hey, would it be a problem if I didn't start my captain's career course when I'm scheduled to and did this? Lucy asked me to do. No, not really. It's a little bit off, but whatever. If that's what you want to do, yeah, we can support that. And as part of your overall development as an MP officer, serving in the schoolhouse is something that kind of we want you to get at some point in your career. So if you can get it now, fine. So I ended up serving about 18, 19, close to 2 years, but not a full 2 years on this project, which turned out to be a real big project. What they call a Force Development Test and Experimentation, FDTE. And it ended up having a major exercise involving special forces, aggressors, and it was a field exercise. And we had soldiers wearing, with experts from Walter Reed, the old Walter Reed and Watch, they were wearing wrist actigraphs, which in 1985 was a big deal, technology, measuring their sleep patterns and their brain. This was high level stuff, that worked out fine. It was a lot of responsibility for a no time and grade captain. At that point, but again, the common theme is, and I was definitely trying to just stay above water. For the longest time. And then about 8 months into that assignment, one of not the 06, the colonel, but one of the lieutenant colonels I worked for called me in and introduced me to a master sergeant and said, this guy is going to be working with you for the next year or so. And this guy had just come. His name was Master Sergeant Ulm, ULM, and he had just come off of the drill sergeant trail. He had been a senior drill sergeant. He was an E7 drill sergeant, actually trained the troops, and then he got promoted to E8. And for a while, he was like what they call a senior drill sergeant. He really was overseeing the day-to-day, the NCOs that were actually interacting with troops. And I guess he, at a certain point, either he wanted to be assigned to another part or someone decided. So I got him, and again, as had been true earlier in my career, it was like a infusion, of talent and competence. And so I did that. And then I served in my captain's career course, which at that stage in history was still a large course. It was like 58 people in my captain career course. They later went to a small group model, which was 12 or 13, but I was like one of the last before they had ratcheted down to that new program. So I had 56 folks in my captain's career course, most of them were young captains too, and just a good group, really talented group of people that you learn from. And it was quite an experience. Then I went to career. First time in career. I ended up doing 2 tours of career. That was my first time in career. Took an MP company shortly after arriving and was still really junior, really green. Yeah, definitely, still making stupid mistakes. I was privileged to take the first, my first colors as a company commander with less than 6 years in the Army, 5.5 years in the Army. And although I had a lot of time as a platoon leader and knew something about leadership and stuff, I still had a lot of growing up to do, but I had some superb NCOs in that group, many of them who later went on to be sergeant majors.
If someone looked at your career up till this point, they would go, gosh, Mike has been so lucky to have all of these people that were willing to mentor him and pass on their leadership knowledge and their experiences and all of that. My question is, do you think you were necessarily lucky to have all of those people in your path, or was it part of you to listen to what they said? You know what I'm asking?
Yeah. No, I do. And I would say they work hand in hand. In other words, at some point, right, we're all human beings. And if you're talking to me and I'm not listening, at what point do you say, well, the heck with him? I'm not going to waste my breath, The flip side of that is if I don't respect what you offer or what I think you can offer the organization and me personally, I'm probably not going to listen to you. So it's sort of a synergistic thing. I believe that, and I've seen it throughout my life, I believe the way we operate, the way we're wired as human beings, particularly in the military construct, people are willing, for the good of the team, to try to impart their wisdom, experience, knowledge to someone else, either a teammate, a peer, subordinate, or a senior person. If that person repeatedly rebuffs those advances and repeatedly shows that I really don't care what you think, this is what we're going to do, and they can do that in sort of a draconian way, being very nasty and rude and hierarchical, or they can just literally do it without being nasty, But at some point, the person who's trying to convey experience, knowledge, and expertise will stop doing that. So I'm not saying I was the best listener or I am the best listener, but what I cultivated was this sort of mindset that all of us are smarter than any of us. I'm not the smartest guy in the room. Now, when you're a captain, everyone knows that. But I had that same attitude as a colonel. Look, guys, we've all been in the Army a long time. We all know who's the senior person. I don't need to rub that in your face. But let me also say that I don't think I'm the smartest guy in the room. And part of your evolution as an officer is you have to accept that, When I was a lieutenant, as a way of getting my soldiers to respect the maintenance of our equipment, particularly our weapons, and keep them, because that you have to do that. I mean, if you let weapons just sit and you don't use them, they get mildew, they get dirty, they get rusty, and then they won't work when you need them. So I always wanted our weapons in the arms room to be lubricated, trained, ready to go on a moment's notice. One of the sort of the machismo things I used to do to help stimulate is I would just challenge, and a lot of it was just pure talk trash. I'd tell my soldiers, look, I can take apart a weapon faster than any of you, And of course, then you're bringing out the competitive spirit, And in fact, I can do it blindfolded. And of course, I would practice that. I wouldn't just boast, but that produced those competitions, where people, would say, "Hey, sir, I know I can be." Well, let's go, let's do it, And it really didn't matter who won. What mattered was people knew I cared about weapons maintenance and was competent in my own individual weapon. And that sort of got contagious, who the hell does he think he is? I think, what I realized though over time is, while I could do that as a lieutenant, if some Spec 4 in my brigade 20 plus years later said, "Sir, I'll challenge you," I wouldn't even enter the competition because I knew my skills in those specific type of tactical skills were not the same as an 06 as they were as an 02, So your whole career is a product of evolution. And by the time I was a senior guy, I really thought of myself as a coach. Like, I am privileged to be given this team. When I inherited this team, this is the record it had, and obviously not, but this is the rep of this brigade, battalion, whatever, right? And these are the people who are stars on this team. These are the people who could be stars, but are not for whatever reason. And I really took it upon myself to, and what does a coach do, right? A coach picks the right players for the right position. They call the right plays at the right time. They sort of create an environment, a healthy environment. They get that winning culture. I really saw my duties as a commander as very similar to those of a coach, of a college football coach, basketball, whatever, And I tried to facilitate that. And so, roundabout way back to your question, I became a better listener, but really what I was able to do was put the onus on the NCOs, because the way the system works, this as a veteran yourself in two services, people will push decisions to the leader. And I learned at a very young age that, I can make that decision, but that's not a captain decision. That's not a major's decision. That's your decision. So you make the decision. And I just tried to create an environment, the culture that, look, we're going to do things ethically. We're going to follow the regulations. We're going to do things ethically. We're not going to lie, cheat, ethically, morally. Those are the parameters. And other than that, Bill Krieger might do something differently than Mike Galoucis, or this person over here. That's fine. Just do it ethically, do it morally, follow regulations, and get the job done. And what I learned over time is people really, when you first talk like that, people don't, he's full of crap, he'll burn us, But when things happen, if they see you've had their back, you've got their back, then that just breeds that. And then once you get that going, you can have some remarkable success. You really can. You got to give my thing over time became, if my unit's catching flack or one of my people, I was very paternal. I'll take the flack. That's so. Don't shoot that soldier, sir. That person was operating off of my direct guidance or my intent. And then the flip side of that is if praise is coming, you did a remarkable job. No, sir, I didn't do a remarkable job. That company did a remarkable job. That soldier did a remarkable job. That NCO, that junior officer, And once people really believe that, hey, this guy's sincere about that, anything can happen, and that's that really was what I tried to become as I got more senior. And you learn, you make mistakes, you reflect, you do an internal after action report. Whoa, that didn't go as I thought it was going to be, But I kind of always felt that, I don't know. I never really became politically correct. I even as a young officer, I challenged authority, not to challenge authority, but if I thought something was wrong, I'll give you a couple of examples, right? As a young lieutenant, I used to have to pull duty at that air defense site, 24-hour duty. So you have a lot of time. You're there, you're there for PT. You stay the whole 24-hour cycle before you get to go home. So sometimes the night involved activities. It was busy. Other times it didn't. And one night I happened to have the 32nd Army Air Defense Command's FY 81 commander's philosophy. You open up, there's a 2-star, heading, and this is this guy's philosophy. And these are his priorities for this fiscal year. And I'm reading it. I'm thinking to myself, this guy has more MPs in the 32nd ADCOM Command than an MP Brigade commander has, because you have all these platoon leaders all over the place. I mean, you add them all up, you have a lot of MPs. Oh, by the way, it's early 80s. The Baader-Meinhof gang is operating in Germany. There's strong opposition against nuclear weapons being stationed in Germany. There's, terrorism is alive and well. This was long before 9/11 or some of the other more visible terrorist incidents that occurred affecting military. And this guy don't talk anything about security or his MPs, So on an old typewriter, peck, 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 peck. That night on duty, I write a note. Of course, you get a kick out of this. Anytime you start a note with all due respect, sir, or anytime you start that verbally, you're actually saying just the opposite, right? I sent a note to the 32nd Army Air Defense Commander, Major General, and I said, with all due respect, Major General Cooper, his name was, I have just finished reading your FY 81, fiscal year 81 objectives. And quite frankly, sir, I'm disappointed that there's no mention of your military police or physical security within this thing. It's all focused on air defense. Well, obviously, I understand as an air defense commander, that's important. Look at the environment, and then I proceeded to give him about 6 bullets. Recommend in future editions of this or an addendum to this, you include these goals. Well, I didn't think anything of it. I mean, I didn't know if anyone would read it. I sent it. This is back in the snail mail day, so I mailed it, Darmstadt, Germany, APO, whatever. And I remember the next time I saw my brigade commander, who I had a tremendous amount of respect for, a guy named Bill Windsor, big, tall guy. I think he was from Texas. He sees me, so he puts his arm around me. Where did you come? Oh yeah, the letter writer, and I was like, I was kind of grim. I don't know I couldn't tell if he was about to, knock me out and I said, hey, sir, that might not have been the brightest thing to do. And he stopped me in my tracks. This type of quality leadership I work for. I said, no, Mike, that's exactly what I expect you to do. He said, and you know what? What you told the general is spot on. He said, what you said was right. And he needs to hear that from guys like you, because sometimes, they get lost in the clouds. And I was relieved. And the next part of that story was, back in those days, the 32nd Army Air Defense Commander and his CSM would fly around in Hueys. And a lot of times when they flew, it was not a good thing. Like when they arrived at your site, a lot of times it was not a good thing because they would come in with a captain and a first sergeant with them. They would relieve the captain and first sergeant, take the old guys out and put the new ones in. I mean, it was really, normally when you saw that bird coming, it was not a good sign, you know? So he was hovering and landed at our site one day. And I was in a different area. I was in what they call the launching area. He was in the admin area, kind of a half mile away or so. But we could see the bird come in, you know, and I was like, oh, God. But I didn't think it was anything to do with me. But about 10 minutes after the bird landed, I get a call, battery commander wants to see you in his office, you know. And I was mindful that the bird had landed. So I go up there. My stomach is just, you know, I mean, I don't know what's going to happen. I report to the battery commander, and who comes in like a second, must have been the bathroom. So he comes in a minute later. It's the 2-star. It's Cooper, you know. And he basically tells me same thing that the 06 said. Hey, Mike, I read your note. Very thoughtful. Pretty courageous here, young man, to write me. Hey, sir, no courage involved. It may be stupid. And he goes, no. And he just reiterated that, you know. But that was like who I was. It wasn't that I was trying to be a smart act. None of the soldiers knew that I did that. Later, the other officers found out. But I mean, I didn't do it to, you know, get attention or fame. I was just sincere, speaking from the heart, you know. And I had a similar situation at that air defense site with a colonel who was inspecting our site. We had inspections all the time on a nuclear site. It annoying, and it was stressful. It was a zero defect environment, high stress. I tell people I started that job looking like Elvis Presley. I had a full head of hair, and look at me now, you know, but not entirely accurate, but partially. But I remember this colonel deployed what they called the backup security force. So there was a standard, that backup security force had to show up within X amount of time to an incursion with all their equipment. And that was part of the evaluation to verify if they could do that, you know? So he had done that earlier in the day. And it's pretty rigorous, particularly in the summer, you know, these guys were tired, and something about that first response he didn't like. So about 30 minutes later, he goes, you know, I'm going to deploy your BAF, it's called the BAF, backup, you know, alert force, again. And I was like, sir, why are you going to do that? Well, who the hell are you to ask me why I'm going to do that? Well, sir, I'm just curious because you just did it and they met the standard. So, you know, and, you know, I should have been docile. At that time, I'm the first time talking to a full colonel, you know, and I remember we were actually walking up the tower as we're having this conversation to one of our towers, and my platoon sergeant's like right behind me. So at a certain point, I'm looking at the colonel, my platoon sergeant, E7 SFC, is right behind him, and I'm starting to get into it with this colonel, you know, as the first 10. And I remember at some point I said words to the effect of like, well, sir, you know, I've got to look these people in the eye every day. I'm here on site every day, and you come down once a year. And I think I pointed at him, and my platoon sergeant's behind him goes, you know.
Right. Probably not the right way to handle it.
Yeah, you know, I mean, so immature, you know. So the good news is he decided, for whatever reason, not necessarily my thoughts, to not deploy them. But there was like a cloud hanging over the rest of the evaluation. And this was a big deal. This was what they called a Nuclear Weapons Technical Inspection, NWTI. So I remember at the out brief, everyone's on pins and needles. Because, you know, people get relieved. I mean, this is big deal, you know. That colonel who was an A&M, I remember he was a Texas A&M guy, he out briefs, and it's a very short out brief. He goes through all the things they evaluate. No comment, no deficiency, you know, boom, no comment. And he goes, this is one of the, you know, he wraps it up. He says, in short, the final out brief evaluation is no comment, no deficiencies noted. Superb, you know, congratulations to the leadership team and the soldiers. And he leaves, you know, and on his way out, he makes a beeline to me. And he said, I forget, he says, like, you're one cantankerous goddamn lieutenant. But you know what? Your soldiers love you and they respect you. And we need more guys like you in the Army. And I tell you what, because I really thought that he was going to be vindictive And even if he flunked just my platoon, that would have affected the whole outcome. You can't have any failing deficiencies, because one failing deficiency, the whole site fails. So right. A lot of pressure. And I was immature and stupid to get into it with him, because I was myopic in thinking about what and not the big picture of how my comments and my relationship with this colonel over the next 2 days are going to impact the whole unit. So I was stupid. I mean, I admit that. I admit it then. But that's the type of guy I was. I mean, I would challenge something. And even as a leader later in my life, I'd always tell my troops, if you see or hear of something you think is absurd, challenge it, and I'll get your back every time. And it's kind of neat how you build that culture. And units definitely are a reflection of their leadership, and if whatever culture, whatever things you emphasize and check on, that's what's going to happen.
Let's take a quick break.
Veterans Archives is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on donations from our listeners. If you are enjoying these stories and would like to support our continued efforts, please go to www.veteransarchives.org and select the donate button. Thank you.
Yes. So let's fast forward. Speaking of this, is a great transition.
Okay.
And that is, we were talking about you were going to Korea as a company commander. And so let's continue on with that part of the discussion as well.
Well, after that, I went to Fort Hood, Texas. Coming back from there, I had some schooling in there. I had the Combined Armed Services Staff School, which was a great school. It was early in its infancy at that point when the Army came up with that school. Again, teaching you how to be a good staff officer. And I had an advantage because I had been blessed to have a great tutor back in Germany years before in Massillon-Faber, so I went into that course. I did learn a lot of new things. But here's another one of those breaks. Does it just happen, or, someone watching over me? I don't know. But my first assignment at Fort Hood turned out to be in a job that I was routinely briefing the Corps commander, a 3-star general. Now, again, I'm a mid-level captain. I'm still a young guy. I commanded a company. I've done a tour in Germany, done a tour in Korea. So, but I'm still only 7 years in the Army. And here I am standing in front of the Corps commander briefing. And I remember the first time I briefed him, my hands were perspiring. I don't know. I've never had that before. I kind of never really got nervous too much. I could definitely tell, And I remember I was in a quandary because the way they did it, you would brief him on a terrain, on a big terrain board that was sort of approximating what our wartime mission would be, 3 corps in Germany, And so I remember when I got up to brief him, I immediately realized I had a quandary because they wanted you to use like a laser pointer to point out different things on this large room-sized map and, with terrain features. There was a microphone they gave you, and then I had my notes with bullets on it, and as it's like I only got 2 hands. I'm thinking to myself really quick, I got 2 hands and they want me to do 3 things. So I opted to not use the microphone because it wasn't that big a crowd. And the Corps commander was like essentially right in front of me, but there were some other people there, other generals. So I just put down the microphone and I used the cards and the laser point because they wanted you to use that, But the course that I had taken really helped me organize as a staff officer, really helped me kind of go through the Fort Hood assignment quickly because I want to get to the next phase of the career. But I felt like I'd only commanded a company in Korea for around 13 months. It wasn't a real long tour. And I definitely felt as I gave up the colors of that, man, I'm still a newbie. I still got a lot to learn about leadership. And I know you really learn leadership lessons when you're in a leadership position. It's hard to learn how to improve as a leader in a staff job. You can, but it's every day as a commander, company commander, platoon commander, battalion, brigade, whatever, is a leadership laboratory. So I wanted to command another company, and the way it was structured in Korea, it's kind of like an assembly line. They pump guys through there, So when I was at Fort Hood, I wanted to command an another company. I was in an MP Brigade, lots of companies. And I talked to my brigade commander, who I had built a good relationship with. And his name was Peter D. Hoffman. I'm still close to him. He's a great great guy, very warm, very intelligent, very loyal person. And he had come from military police branch where he was managing all the MP offices, So when I talked to him about the possibility of commanding, he said, Mike, look, I'd love to give you another command, but we got 8-10 captains in the queue who have not commanded a company yet. You've already commanded a company. You've done what the Army wanted you to do. And yeah, sir, it's, a little bit more than a year. I know, but we got guys here who have commanded a day, so I don't see that happening. Maybe, but so I realized, and he was honest with me, I realized, okay, that's not going to happen. And what ended up happening is some of the guys on the Corps staff and the division staff that I met in those quarterly briefings to the Corps commander went down to command combat arms units. These were combat arms officers that went to the 2nd Armored Division or the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood to command, their battalion or their brigade. So one of the guys said, look, and we were close, we had gone on a couple of exercises together. We deployed overseas together on a couple of things. He was like, look, when I go down to 2AD, I'm going to try to get you to be my headquarters company commander. I'll when that position becomes available, I'll get you down there. He says, hey, look, I've got to fill this position now. Can you get released? And at that point, I had only been in the MP Brigade about 17 months, 16 months. I said, well, sir, I'll check with my commander, but I'm not overly optimistic, to be honest with you. They kind of already told me they need to stay here 2 years before they let me move. And that's how it played out. So he goes, well, I've got to fill this. So, he said, but look, here's the deal. I'll talk to the brigade commander about you, and we'll see what we can do. So, boom. About 6 months later, I get a call from the deputy brigade commander of the 2nd St. Lo Brigade. St. Lo was a city in France that was part of once we hit D-Day and then we're breaking out. It was a very famous city there. And so this brigade had fought in that conflict as Combat Command Bravo in World War II. And so it had been eventually renamed the 2nd, instead of Combat Command Bravo, 2nd Brigade, St. Lo Brigade, because it had distinguished itself in St. Lo in France. So I go down there. Now, I'm doing a little bit of snooping around, like, why would this brigade commander be looking for an MP? I knew the other guy because I had built a relationship with him, but this guy. What I find out from my buddies that are in 2nd Armored Division and other parts is this brigade commander is one of the biggest fill in the blanks, in the division. I mean, he's a real hard guy to work for. He's rough on his people. But I figure, hey, do you want to command or not? So I go down to do my interview and I, report in, to the colonel. Sir, Captain Galoucis reporting as directed. And I kind of relax a little bit because I had a great relationship with my brigade commander in the MP Brigade because I used to always brief him before we briefed the Corps commander. It was kind of a more relaxed mind. So I don't know that I went too at ease, but I definitely, relaxed a little bit. And he was like, I didn't give you at ease. This son of a gun, and I could use other terms other than gun, he kept me at the position of attention for like 35 minutes. I mean, his interview, quote, interview of me, I was at the position of attention. And it was pretty rough. And I could tell right away, first meeting, this, but I don't know. I always reflect, am I a masochist? Because I ended up accepting that job. It was offered to me. And I think it was mainly offered because no one wanted to work for the guy. And I ended up going down there and commanded a Bradley Mech Infantry Brigade headquarters company, and did that for 2+ years, an extended period. And that was a great experience, very tough duty. We had 2 national training center rotations out to Fort Irwin. We deployed to Germany for a Reforger, return of forces to Germany exercise. And it seemed like we were always in the field. This guy loved the field, And as his headquarters commander, I mean, you had to make sure his vehicles and the brigade TOC were always, and they were tracked vehicles back then. They were, even though we had Bradleys in the brigade, this was not, his vehicles were still using the old 577s, which is sort of a modified 113 armored personnel carrier, and they had configured it into a TOC. It was tough duty, but I'll tell you what, I learned a lot. And he's one of those guys, and I had a lot of respect for his competence. I mean, he was a very competent guy, and overall, he turned out to be a pretty decent guy. Very hard. He was kind of on the cusp as the Army was transitioning from, the commanders that could not smile in a command photo and were always gruff, that sort of authoritarian, to more of a genteel, you could smile in your chain of command. He was old school, totally, and I'd spent a lot of time in the Ranger Regiment as a younger officer. Pretty hardcore guy, but I learned a lot from him. And part of what I found out over the years is you almost learn more from people, in the sense that, like with him, I actually learned, and this is really not intended to demean him, but I kind of learned from him, I don't want to be that kind of leader. It's not that he was a horrible leader. That's not my style. And I believe as a leader, you should be yourself, So I kind of learned, no, I don't really want to emulate most of what I see with him, other than his dedication, his competence, his love for soldiers. I mean, he really loves soldiers, but he's just a rough guy, And
would you say, Mike, that a lot of lessons that you may have learned, a lot of it's mentorship and here's how to do things. But would you say that sometimes it's how not to do things is what we learn?
Absolutely. And to your point, that's exactly the lesson I took away from this guy. And it wasn't entirely, it wasn't like, 100% that. And no, I learned a lot of tactical field craft from him. I learned a lot about how to pace yourself for extended operations. This guy really worked himself hard. He worked as hard as anybody in the brigade, But yes, to your point, Bill, I did learn, no, that's not how you should treat people. That's old school. The Army's evolving. That's not my basic personality. I can't be that guy. So yeah, you do learn what's right and how to do it. And you also learn, hey, that's not the right way to do it, or that's not what I want to do, What was interesting in that assignment was, and this was really a career changer for me, this was a real major shift. So the Army, at that point in history, I don't know how they do it now, I've been out many years, but at that point in history, they wanted all of its officers to have 2 specialties. So, and the concept is you get trained and certified in your basic specialty, and then at that point, you pick up a secondary specialty. And in a perfect world, if you're following the Army's career development model, at that point in history, you get trained and certified in your secondary specialty. So that as a more senior officer, maybe at the 05 level, you're trained in 2 distinct specialties and however the Army wants to utilize it. So when I was in that headquarters infantry company assignment, it was my turn to designate a secondary specialty. I was fortunate that the MP branch chief came to Fort Hood, and I talked to the guy. He had been someone that I briefly knew in Germany, had served in the same battalion, 95th MP battalion. And he basically said, hey, what do you want to do? And I was like, well, sir, I kind of want to be a 54, which was operations, number 54. Or maybe, I think it was a 2021 or something. It was admin and personnel. And that was the common thing, that a lot of officers like myself chose. And he said, well, why do you want to do that? And I said, well, sir, I know to be competitive for battalion command someday, I probably need to be a 54. And he goes, yeah. He said, look, any good field grade officer should be good in personnel or good in ops or good in both, So, and he gave me some of the best advice I've ever had. And he said, look, let me tell you something. You don't know this now, and I can't give you great details because not all those details are known. But in the next 6 months, there's going to be a huge drawdown of the United States Army. And as a guy who lived through the drawdown after Vietnam, let me give you some insight. Let me give you some advice here. My advice is you get something completely different. Ops and admin is not that different than what you're doing now. I mean, they're all kind of in the same family. Get something completely different, because after Vietnam, we had a drawdown. A lot of guys got riffed out of the Army. We might be going through that again. I don't know. But I would encourage you, Mike, to get a completely different specialty so that if we ever go through a major drawdown where we start actually riffing officers, reduction in force of officers, you've got 2 distinct specialties. And I said, oh, hey, sir, that's pretty interesting. Now, what he was alluding to was the fall of the Berlin Wall, the dissolution of the Soviet Union, and the peace dividend that Bill Clinton talked about and it eventually occurred. So he said, what do you like to do? And I said, well, I don't know. I like to write. I like to take pictures, And I didn't know what his alternate specialty was. I later found out. But he says, well, it sounds like you want to be a public affairs officer. I said, well, I don't know, sir, maybe, He goes, well, give it some thought. and let me know what you want to do. So in the interim, we deployed to Germany for a reforger. And while we're in Grafenwehr, sort of going through the redeployment, last steps before we redeploy, the exercise is over, Stars and Stripes, front page article, President Clinton calls for the Army to be reduced, like by 200,000 people over a 5, So at the time, the Army had about 780,000 people. And the reduction was taking it down to 535. So think about that. I mean, we were going from 20 divisions to 10, from like 4 corps. It was huge. It was unprecedented, So when I read that article, I remember being out in Grafenwehr, just kind of sitting out there having a cup of coffee. And I was, Major Burks, man, he knew about it because he was assigned to Washington, so he had the inside skinny. When I got back to States, I called, this was, again, this was like 1990. I called and let him know, hey, sir, I saw what you said. I mean, I saw that article. I've given some thought. Yeah, I'd like to be public affairs officer, and I'll put that on my preference sheet. He goes, go ahead and do that, but you got it. I'm going to tell you right now, because, he was in a position where he said, you got public affairs. He said, you'll be hearing from your public affairs guy probably the next month or so. And sure enough, so trying to accelerate a lot of different periods into. So basically, at that point, I'm leaving Fort Hood. I actually went to the public affairs course when I came out of company command at Fort Benjamin Harris, and we're one of the best It's called the Department of Defense Public Affairs course. About a 3.5-4 month course. One of the best courses I've been to at that point in my career. Very different course, not physically demanding, but very rigorous academically and writing and learning the Associated Press style guide, for example. I mean, what Army officer knows that, right? Unless they're in public affairs. So a lot of new skills, very good training. And from that point on, I went into a public affairs. I went actually training with industry, where the Army sent me to a program where for about 8 months, I was in two private sector companies, learning public affairs, media, strategic communications, marketing, great, stuff. And then I was assigned for my first tour in the Pentagon. It was kind of interesting because I was married, and I'm still married to the same lady. My wife was a dentist in the Army. So my public affairs assignment guy calls me and says, hey, I've got some really good choices for you. And I'm thinking to myself, wow, I was in the MP for years. Really didn't get that type of service. This was like Baskin Robbins. What do you want? I can assign you to Hollywood to be the Army's liaison to the movie industry. And of course, immediately I'm excited. It's like, I'm all in. And then I said, well, my wife's a dentist. Can you? Yeah, I don't think so. It was just as the Army was coming into this program called the Army Married Couples Program, where they realized a lot of service members were married to each other. And this was an effort institutionally to adapt to that change and to try to get couples together, within a 100-mile radius. The things that they offered me, the one that really was the best for my wife and I, and we were newly married at that point, had a brand young daughter who's now 32. We decided to go to Washington. So my first tour in the Pentagon. So I went right from 2nd Armored Division, Headquarters Company Command, to Public Affairs School, to training with industry, where I wore a suit and tie for a year, not quite a year, less than a year, then into my first assignment in the Pentagon as a public affairs officer. And great assignment. And really what ended up happening was I was initially in what they call command information, which is products related to your internal audience. So it's things you're producing on behalf of the Army. I was in the office of the chief of public affairs, and I was producing, and the folks that were working with me really were the ones doing the work, producing products for the internal Army. And we had the Army News Service, which was kind of like the AP, Associated Press, wire service. We would send out pictures and articles every day to over 300 newspapers worldwide in the Army, and they could run that in their post paper. We wrote speeches, generic speeches for Army birthday, Martin Luther King Day, Memorial Day, and we would send them out, and people could then localize them to their area. The essence of the speech, the historical research of the significance, all the little vignettes you typically would have in a speech like that. we had done all that legwork. All you had to do was plug in your commander's name and your installation name, So I did that. And after about a year, I got called in to see the deputy, which was not normally a good thing. And I thought I was, going to get some type of, feedback that was less than positive. And he said, hey, Mike, the boss wants to see you. I was like, oh, that's not a good, So I go in to see the Major General, Bill McLean, Chief of Public Affairs, Army, Vietnam vet, great guy, still friends with him today. He's down in Texas. And he says, Mike, we're going to have you, we're going to send you up to be interviewed by the Vice Chief of Staff of the Army. We are nominating you to be his media spokesman. And I'm like, I've only been in public. Really, sir? I mean, I'm looking around. Are you talking to me? It's like Robert De Niro from Taxi Driver. Are you talking to me? So I am nervous as hell. I think it's the first time I had ever been it wasn't the first time I've been in the presence of one, but it's now I'm being interviewed by a 4-star. The other times was in Europe. I met the senior commander in Europe a couple of times, but that was, a shake and grin, nothing, Now the stakes are higher, right? I'm a senior captain. I'm going to be in. So I go up and see the vice chief, and he is so kind and warm, and well, Bill McLean says you're the right guy to be my media guy, and it's like, what do you say? So, sir,
how do you argue with that?
Yeah, it's like I'd be honored if you gave me that opportunity, sir. I'll do the best I can. That's all I can promise you. So I ended up doing that job for about a year. I worked with that particular 4-star for about 6 months. And then he left to go to U.S. Forces Command in Atlanta, 4-star command. And they brought in a guy named General Benny P, P-E-A-Y, who had been the 101st commander and later would be the CENTCOM commander down in MacDill Air Force Base. But at that point in history, he was the vice chief. And the vice chief in the Army is like the assistant commandant of the Marine Corps, the assistant chief of naval ops. It's not the top person in the service, but the second person, and really has an important job on the day-to-day running of the military service. And boy, what an exposure that was, And again, though, I was blessed to be working around superb. I mean, these generals were just the epitome of the Army's core values. They were great leaders. They were unpretentious. They were relatively easy. The thing that was different is the stakes are really high at that level. The quality of your staff work has to be really high. You really can't make mistakes because you're advising a 4-star. And if they're taking your advice and you give them bad advice, so a lot of pressure, but the generals made it easier to deal with that pressure because this were such great Americans, such great guys. And then I went to Commandant Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, which is a great, the Army and probably all the services, they give you that year to sort of rejuvenate. You're a young major, you're in an academic setting. It's, you have quality time with your family. We had 2 young kids at that point. And I still had not mentally made the decision I was staying in the Army. I mean, I really had, and I remember one day coming down, we were staying in a very small quarters at Fort Leavenworth called Kickapoo Village. Very kind of Spartan quarters. My wife wasn't really happy on where we were staying. I was like, well, whatever. It's better than a cot, Right. And I remember coming downstairs one morning, getting ready to go to class in uniform. And my 2 kids are sitting in high chairs with, baby food drooling down their face. My wife is there. She didn't have to be to work. This was probably at 6:45, 6:50. So it was a little bit before she had to get in uniform and go to the dental clinic. And I remember giving her a hug and talking to the kids for a minute. And as I walked out the door, I was like an epiphany, like, I guess I'm making the Army a career. I'm here at Commanding Staff College, which was an honor. Not, back in those days, only about half the people got selected for it. So it was definitely an honor to be selected. And here I am at Leavenworth and going to Staff College, and I'm a major. And I kind of had a little bit of a different bounce in my step the rest of the day. And because I now realize, hey, I am committed to this career. That was probably at the, I guess that would have been around the 12, 13 year point of my career. Probably when I was having that feeling, it was at 12 years.
Isn't it interesting that when you're dipping your foot in the pool, whether it's for 2 years or 14 years, right? There's something that does happen to you when you jump in and you're like, I'm all in now.
Right. And Up until then, I really felt that I had given it my all. It wasn't like I had only gone, 70% of the effort, but it was the effort related to whatever job I was doing. There wasn't really, I never really thought about the long-term institutional commitment to the United States Army. And this is my career now. I had always just focused on, hey, you're the platoon leader, you're the assistant 3, you're the company commander. And I had given that job my all, but I never really had thought about, and here I was, so it definitely changed me. And then in the way it's supposed to work, and it did for me, I went back into the military police school. So I had served public affairs for a couple of years at a high level. Now, after Command and Staff College at Fort Leavenworth, Kansas, I went to career back to the same battalion I had been a company commander in once. And now I'm a major, and I'm the operations officer, S3, and I'm the executive officer, the battalion XO. And I do that for 2 years under 2 different battalion commanders. One of the first one that I was there with was a great leader, great friend that I'm still close to today. And I had known him since he was a young officer, crazy. His nickname was Conan the Barbarian. He was larger than life, swore like a sailor, chewed tobacco, loved soldiers, was very highly competent, and that was a great assignment. And we had units dispersed all over Korea. So South Korea is kind of sort of about the size of, I think, Ohio, if I recall. And so we had companies all over that peninsula, essentially. And so he and I agreed with that. But I mean, his thing was he wants to be out with the soldiers. He wants to be, and so we were on the road. I think my wife later told me that I was gone that year like 150 days out of 360. I was literally gone on the road with my battalion commander, Dave Truding, for all that time. And then what happened was, as we made the transition battalion commanders, I was given the opportunity by the brigade commander to elevate and move up to be the executive officer of the battalion. So completely different role. Instead of training and operations and evaluation, external evaluations was my responsibility, marksmanship. As the XO, you kind of running the budget. You're running the command inspection program. You're doing a lot of the admin things that the S3 don't have to worry about. S3 is focused on readiness and training. The XO is really, more the admin side of the operations. And I did that. And one day I'm up at one of our outposts at Camp Humphreys, which has now become a much larger place, where back in those days it was an aviation unit there and an MP. It wasn't that prominent in the whole picture of what we had in Korea at the time. Now it is. I remember coming in from a run. I was running around the airfield. I was absolutely dead. I came back into the orderly room, and it's like 4 PM. I'm dying, And the Spec 4 that's there says, "Hey, sir, you had a call when you were gone." And yeah, right. Was it the battalion commander? No, sir. It was the Pentagon. And I was like, "Yeah, right, sure." He goes, "No, sir, I'm serious." So anyway, I go out for dinner. I come back and take a call, and it's some colonel online. Now, I need to set this up by saying this was our second year over there. My wife is a major in the Army. I'm a major in the Army. And we had already worked out where she was going to be picked up for advanced training at Fort Hood. And I was going to go be the provost marshal of the 1st Cavalry Division, which I had served at Fort Hood early in my career. And I really wanted to go to the 1st Cav. And I was going to be their provost marshal which, although I was not promotable yet, I was a senior major. They had accepted me, the command general had accepted me to be in a lieutenant colonel slot. And we were excited, because my wife had followed me around a couple of times, and now this was really her, so it was a great assignment for both of us. So I just say that as a background. So about 9 o'clock that night, I take the call from Washington, and this guy butchers my name. He doesn't know who I am. He's a colonel, and he said, well, Mike, looks like General Reimer wants to work with you again. Now, Reimer had been picked up to be the chief of staff of the Army after being in Atlanta for 18, 19 months. So my reaction, again, just being the guy who wears his emotion on his sleeve, I was like, because he said, well, sir, Mike, there's some good news here on this call. So that's how he sets it up. And then he goes into, hey, General Reimer wants to work with you again. And I'm like, shit, sir, that's not good news. I'm going to Fort Hood, and I'm like protesting this. Like, sir, this is not good news. I'm not really pleased about this. And finally, the colonel puts down, the colonel acts like the colonel, right? He says, Major, this is not something you have a choice in. You don't say no to the chief of staff of the Army, and then I realize, and the next thing I know, he hands me off to General Reimer, and Reimer, being the gentleman that he always is, Mike, I'm looking forward to working with you again. Well, what do you say, So I ended up getting a little bit of a curtailment of my tour. I went back there a little bit earlier than the full 24 months, but I did enough to get full tour credit. I think I was there 19 months or something. Much to the chagrin of my wife, I left my wife and our 2 young kids there. Dental Corps branch did not give her a drop, so she had to stay there for another 3 months, which was not a good thing for a while, as you can imagine. Not to mention that initially her advanced schooling and training was now out of the picture until we got another thing that came in that helped alleviate that concern. So I ended up going back and I did public affairs for the chief. I was the media advisor and media spokesman for the chief of staff of the United States Army from April of 96 till June of 99, essentially the last 3.5 years of his 4-year tour. And man, that was upping the ante, so to speak. That was, again, and it was kind of interesting. I remember one time early in my tour there, giving him advice, leaning over, kind of behind him in his office in the Pentagon. And I remember thinking to myself, I feel comfortable giving public affairs advice because I had training in that and experience in that, and I worked with this guy before. But what I realized was sort of a dilemma that I was facing is I'm a major advising a 4-star. And so when I look at the Army and look at the world, I'm looking at through the prism of a major. And he's looking at through the prism of a 4-star, which is drastically different. And I felt like I was a little bit concerned about that sort of gap in knowledge, because if I'm to give him good advice, I need to give him advice that will benefit him, not that would benefit him. In other words, my advice has to be much more strategic. And I was kind of in a quandary. I was kind of wrestling with that. I remember on one weekend at home, I was really thinking about that a lot. And I was like, so what I did was, and it was sort of congruent with other things I had done in my life, was ask for advice from people who I respected. And so I had gotten to know some of the generals that were on his staff at the 2-star, 1, 2, and 3-star level that I had met earlier in my career that I knew he trusted. And I just opened my heart to those guys, opened my soul. And I, hey, sir, here's my dilemma. I'm now advising the chief. And I'm a major, just came out of being a battalion XO in career. And, while I've got the public affairs training experience, I feel like in order to do the chief justice and the Army justice, I need to expand sort of how I think. I need to give him advice that he should, and they all offered differing advice, but it was similar in some respects. And the biggest thing that helped me sort of wrestle with that was they said, look, here's the deal. I could tell you this, I could tell you that. You're right in identifying this. You're smart in identifying this. Here's some things to think about, but here's what I do to help you. Anytime on any issue, if you have a question like this on a particular issue, my door is always open. 24/7, literally. Call me. They gave me their cell number. Get a hold of me, and what I'll try to do. And so that really, really helped me because, and in fact, at one point, relatively early in my tour, the general complimented me and said, this is really good work, Mike, and I really appreciate this. Is and he didn't say I didn't expect this type of work from you dumbass, or that, but I knew what he was saying, and I just felt compelled. I said, well, sir, thank you. I appreciate that. But I have to give credit to, Dave Hebner and Ben Griffin and Ron Griffith and some of these other generals that are around you. These are the guys that I'm talking to. Many of the things that I give you, I have vetted with them to make sure I'm looking at it as best I can through the prism of you as the chief. And
Mike, isn't that why he hired you, though? I mean, looking back on it, he hired you because he probably knew that you weren't going to give him advice based on being a major, that you were smart enough to know you needed to rely on other people.
Well, it could have been that, but the other thing I think, going back into that period, now later with guys like Ray Odiano and Dave Petraeus, they were much more savvy with the media. But General Reimer was a guy who served a couple tours in Vietnam. Those guys didn't really like working with the media. It was sort of an uncomfortable thing initially. Now, Denny Reimer got really good with the media. But, a lot of those guys had sort of negative views toward the media initially based on their experiences in Vietnam or what they saw transpire in Vietnam. They attributed some of that to the media. And so it was not like when in terms of what they looked forward to, right? In many cases, they didn't really look forward to engaging the media. They knew it was part of their duties and responsibilities, and I was able to help them philosophically understand that, You're not really speaking. The media is a conduit to the real audience. So no matter what you think of this reporter, is not relevant, really, sir. You're really speaking to the millions of people that publication or that show reaches, But I think what it was he and I bonded a little bit when he was the vice, and he trusted me, and he knew, because at that level you're privy to a lot of information that's sort of close-hold information. Much of it's close-hold information, So I think part of it was the trust, part of it was the comfort factor with me personally, and I think what I was led to believe by other people was when they built the nomination pack and he saw me there, he selected me, because he knew me, as opposed to the other people probably were competitive and good people, good public affairs guys, rather than try to build a relationship new with someone you don't know, as opposed to picking a guy you've already worked with for 8 months and were comfortable with. I think that's how that played out. And, it wasn't always rosy. It wasn't always, there were a couple of tension points, because anytime you deal with the media, I always tell people to a lot of reporters and the way our society is organized, even then, certainly that way now, good news is oxymoronic, right? There's no such thing. 10 planes land today at National Airport and 9 of them land perfectly without incident. But one of them, the wheel falls off and they find out the pilot was drunk and there was, that's the one that's going to make the news, not the 9 that, So it was an interesting time, but we got through some really challenging issues, and he was a great guy to work for because he did appreciate the media, And then he retired. I worked with him right up until the last day that he retired, June 1999. And shortly thereafter, I was privileged to take the command of the military police battalion at Fort Riley, Kansas. And I had been selected for that in my last year working for the general as a public affairs guy. And I went out to Fort Riley, which was great assignment for my wife and I. And it was really you think about the time frame. I was there from June, I think it was June or early July of 99 to June or early July of 2001. So it was that last pre-9/11 period. And it was just a great assignment. I mean, it was absolutely great.
And that was the 89th, right? Out of Fort Riley?
That unit was called, eventually morphed into what was called the 924th Military Police Battalion. The 89th I commanded later. So that battalion, we had a unit in Bosnia. We sent units to Kuwait. It was a very busy time frame, and I wore 3 hats there. I was the military police battalion commander with all the responsibilities that came with that in terms of leading the soldiers and training and maintenance, health and welfare. I was the installation director of emergency services. So I had the police and fire departments aligned under my oversight as a staff guy. And I was also the division provost marshal, because the division at the time there was the 24th Infantry Division. So the biggest one that consumed my time was the battalion commander. But I'll tell you, the day-to-day running the police and fire was not inconsequential. And that was the one I would typically get calls at 3 a.m. And so during that assignment, and later when I was at Fort Hood as the 89th Military Police Brigade commander, I had a walkie-talkie, like we used to call brick, radio. And I had a sweater, a black sweatshirt with fluorescent letters, military police. I had the reflectorized belt and my running shoes and sweatpants. And those were right next to my bed. And I had given the NCOs that were, and the duty officer, which was an officer, and the NCOs that worked the desk, I'd given them a list of criteria, which we call in the Army Commander's Critical Information Requirements, CCIR. So if any of these things happened, I want to be called. And typically, probably 4 times a week at night, next to my wife, I'd have to get up, get the call, and oftentimes would leave. I'm one of those guys, and this is how I was trained young, and it was a very good training. Depending on what was happening, I want to be on site myself. When I brief the commanding general or the chief of staff of the installation, in many cases, they were colonels or above. They're always colonels or above, sometimes general officers, right? I don't want to be like in that role of the middleman. Like, you told me this has happened. Now I'm telling this guy who's senior to me, and he's asking me a question I don't know, so I got to go back to you. I realized for serious things, you ask me a question, sir, I'm right on site. There's 10 tanks that have rolled off the railhead and are now down in the ditch. And it's like, how do I know that? Because I'm at the railhead in Copper's Cove,
Right. I can see them.
Yeah, I'm looking right at them, sir. And yes, they are smoldering. No one's been hurt. So that was a great assignment. And then again, my career shifted in a not as much as the public affairs shift. So we're home. We're back in Maryland. We kept our house. We had bought a house on our first tour in the Pentagon. We kept it. We rented it out while we were gone. Now we're back after 3 years. Leavenworth for a year, Korea for almost 2 years. And we're unpacking boxes. We're going through the tedious thing of resettling in the house. Everyone that's been in the military, moved. I think I moved 13 times in 30 years.
Oh, yeah.
The air conditioning's not working. We got 2 young kids. We're going through boxes. This stuff got broken. It's an unpleasant day. I mean, it's one of those things you get through. You have to get through to get to the next stage. But it's not. And this is back in the old days when you actually have a phone, in your house, on a wire, and phone rings, and my wife gets and she says, "It's for you." I said, "Well, who is it?" We're all there's already a strain between my wife, on that day. Who is it? I don't know. It's some market or whatever. I'm not going to talk to him. So I get on the line, and I'm getting on the line thinking it's a marketing call or something. So look, I don't know who you are. I don't want to talk to you. I'm about ready to hang up. Now, this person that I'm talking to had identified themselves, but they said it quickly. I didn't recognize the name, and my wife had kind of led me to believe it's a marketer. So I get on the line. "Hey, I don't have time to talk to you. Sorry, I'm about ready to him." And the guy says, Hey, Mike, this is General Pete Corelli. So he had said his name real quick. This is Pete Corelli. I don't know. I never recognized his name. And I was like, "Oh, sir." Okay, sir. How can I help you? I mean, I don't think we know each other. So he was a 1-star at the time, and he was being assigned to the Pentagon for his first tour. And one of his general, colleagues, friends had told him, "Hey, if you're going to survive the Pentagon, you need to get a good XO, because, a lot of brand new brigadiers go to the Pentagon and that's it. They die in the vine, and some of them go and they become 4-stars, So this friend of his, who later I found out was a friend of mine, said, "Hey, I got a guy for you," and the other guy was an MP, and he was trying to take care of me as an MP. And long story short is I ended up working he asked me to come as his executive officer. I had assignment orders to the Pentagon, to the operations part of the Pentagon, what they call the G3 of the Pentagon, Deputy Chief of Staff for Operations, Plans, and Training. But that's a huge organization in the Pentagon, and I did not have a pinpoint when he called me. So I said, "Hey, sir, I've got orders to Des Ops, but I don't have a pinpoint." "Good. Well, you're going to be my XO." And I was like, "Sir, if that's what I knew it was an honor to work in the Army Operations Center. I had worked there before, intermittently. And so I reported to duty as his executive officer. So I'm like a gatekeeper, a Pentagon gatekeeper. I'm right outside the general's office, and make his schedule, do a lot of different things, make sure that his intent is being met by the sections that are led by colonels. And he's a great guy. We're friends to this day. I'm working closely with him on another project I can address later if you want. But I mean, it's all good. Hard, long hours. And then, of course, I'm in his office one Tuesday morning, and the plane had already hit the building in New York. But like everyone, we presumed it was an accident, some freak accident or something. Early, we presumed that.
Right. Right.
And I was in his office, and while I'm like, he's at his desk doing something, he has a television screen sort of off to the right, maybe, 3-second walk to where the screen is displayed. And it was on mute, and it's on CNN. And we see the second plane hit. And I say, hey, sir, we probably ought to look at this, so we unmuted him. At that point, we realized we're in a wartime footing. It wasn't an accident twice,
Right.
And then we immediately activated the crisis action team floor, which was, a bunch of people that were not there. Now we have to man these. I mean, we're going to war, And in the midst of all that, about 9:30 that morning, we hear, I don't even know how to describe it. It was almost like a thud. I mean, it was something it wasn't imminent. It wasn't right next door to us, but something definitely occurred. And we realized the Pentagon had been struck, So I'm standing right next to Pete Corelli when the plane hits the building on 9/11. And we never were at risk to lose people based on, thermal flames, even the thing that I always describe people, what happened in the place where we work is a lot of the fire, the automatic sprinkler systems were going off. And there was something in the air. I didn't wear glasses at the time or contacts, but everybody who wore glasses, and particularly those who wore contacts, there was like a real fine, weird smell, like a chemical, just terribly annoying, and particularly to people's eyes. And it was very pungent. It was weird. It wasn't like burning smoke, like you burn, the grill in your backyard, the normal smoke that other parts of the Pentagon that were more directly struck were experiencing, and the heat. We didn't have any of that, but we just had this really annoying odor and a fine mist and whatever very light smoke that might have been entering the place was almost indiscernible, but people who wore contacts were going crazy, and we just dealt with that. And man, that was rough, as everyone knows. And, that was a hard year. I stayed there through July of 2002. And I mean, I don't want to bore you or your audience with the detail. I mean, we transitioned to wartime footing. That AOC went from a place that was busy, but staffed moderately, and that's how it's organized, But then in a wartime footing, it grows to twice the size. Tons of people there. The chief of staff of the Army and his sergeant major and they relocated from the other part of their normal office space down. Just a tremendous experience.
So you said that the staff there grows during wartime, of course.
Yes.
But now you have this damage to the building. I mean, that had to present some special challenges to bringing everybody in, because you want them at the Pentagon. You don't want to go someplace else because.
No, you had to. Yeah.
How does that look?
Well, for us, the side of the building that was struck had no physical impact on where we worked, but obviously post 9/11, the security provisions to enter the building became more stringent. Parking became more difficult for people. I mean, that place essentially at 9:35 on September, that Tuesday morning, that place shifted to 24/7 operations. And not austere, because it's always 24/7, but normally after normal duty, I was very austere present. Now this is full up manning 24/7, and it was that way for years. And it was an incredible experience. The general was absolutely the right guy to lead us during that time. I mean, he was a great leader. He really intelligent. Drove himself, I mean, I used to have to tell him as his XO, sir, you need to get some sleep. You have to get some sleep. I mean, your mind cannot function indefinitely with no sleep. He worked hard, but he built a really good team. We had some competent people, and that became sort of the hub. So the general wore two hats. He was the Army's director of the Army Operations Center, which is sort of a hub of, it's kind of like the Army's Tactical Operations Center. It's where the chief goes to get updates on what's happening throughout the Army. So it was a very important headquarters Also involved in, once we deployed people into Iraq and Afghanistan, this was a hub of where the field commander's requirements eventually came through the Joint Staff and to us, where we would have to identify and build a rotation which Army units were going to be the next ones going into those locations. Very active, headquarters. Also directly involved in the force protection initiatives that post 9/11 were put into. I mean, the Army went from being all the installations were open to being closed, and so right. that had tremendous implications for the Army, budget-wise, tactically. How are we going to meet these requirements at the installation level to secure the posts and make them close? Lots of different stuff. But he also, the years before, the Secretary of Defense had designated the Army as the executive agent for what they call military support to civilian agencies. So in other words, to other federal agencies, to state and local governments. So he wore two hats: one, director of Army Operations; second hat was the director of military support, the DOMS, what they call DOMS. And of course, as you can imagine, after 9/11, particularly with New York, there was a lot of requests for military support because the level of attack and devastation was huge in New York City,
Oh, yeah.
So, but he was the right guy to lead that, and that was a kind of an all-in situation where everybody that was there knew that this is unprecedented. Our Pentagon was attacked, our cities were attacked. The closest thing people could equate to this was maybe Pearl Harbor, in 41. And so everybody got all in on that, worked hard, did some remarkable things, and then I left there and I was still a lieutenant colonel. I was a young lieutenant colonel. I was a senior lieutenant colonel. I'd already commanded a battalion when I got that job. And I worked with some incredible people. I mean, I could take a whole segment of your show just talking about all the things that occurred there. But I was so proud to be part of that team because it truly was an incredible team. And to witness firsthand how the Army transitioned from a peacetime setting to a wartime setting, was memorable. And I was just tremendously proud to be part of that effort. And then I had the luxury of basically taking a year off to go to the National War College. So in the same way that I left a pretty competitive, somewhat rigorous environment to go to Army Staff College many years earlier, now I was, put my heart and soul into all the jobs I had: Major, S3XO, spokesman and media advisor to the Chief of Staff of the Army, battalion command, 9/11, the year after 9/11. Now I had sort of a pit stop, a respite to go to the National War College. And what an incredible experience that was. And the real purpose of War College is to get officers who've been primarily focused on tactics during their earlier part of their career and have served mostly at the tactical level now to think strategically, because you're going to be an 06. If you're at this school, typically you're going to be at least an 06, and many goes on to be 4 stars. One of my classmates was not Steve Rogers, I forget his first name, but a guy who later became a 4-star Naval Admiral, Rogers. He was a 06 when I was an 06, and then, so great experience, great faculty. It's at Fort McNair, and it's really just a great year to pause, take a knee, think about strategy, academic setting. Very, very challenging. It's rigorous, You just can't go there and just screw off the whole year. You got to put some effort into it. They have oral exams where that was a difference. I never had a course like that, a program where after you're there about 4 or 5 months, everything you've studied early on, now you're standing before 3 or 4 or seated before 3 or 4 professors, almost like defending a dissertation, but you're not defending a dissertation. You're there. They can ask you any question on any of the material you've been studying since, early August. And now it's December, And so it's a little bit challenging. And these people are some of them are former military or current military. They're almost all of them are PhDs or true subject matter experts. Some of them might have been your instructors in these courses. And just think of the range of things they could ask you. It's pretty, but man, it's a great program. And then there's very aggressive athletic program there. And it's a joint service school. So the nice thing I liked about National is only 200 people in the class. So 40 are international students from any country that we had relationships with at the time. That was kind of what was true at Command and Staff College too, a lot of international students, but a much larger class there, 1,100 people at Command and Staff. This is only 200. 40 people are other federal agencies. So a lot of the three-letter agencies, NSA, CIA, FBI, Department of Defense, civilians, different. And then, the other 120 are divided up proportionally to the military services. So you have Army, Navy, Air Force, Marines, and Coast Guard. And it's a great group of people, very honored to be selected for that. And it really does give you a chance to kind of catch your breath and get good quality time with your family and get prepared for the next stage of your career, So for me, I went back to the Pentagon initially after that National War College, served in an MP staff assignment as the chief of operations for the Office of Provost Marshal General. And then I served, surprisingly, I was surprised when I was told I had been selected for that job. It came out of the blue, really. But I served, and I just, one thing I would say is when I went back to the Pentagon after being gone a year, and I went back to the Army Operations Center, which is where I had been, that even though the place had been refurbished and developed, and painted and reconfigured with a lot of different things, including fluorescent arrows and stuff, so that if the electricity went out as it did on 9/11, you could see where you were going. A lot of enhancements to the building. That same smell that I smelled on 9/11 was there. That same sort of pungent odor. I guess they couldn't get rid of that. So it was real. When I first went back into the building, heading down to where I was working in the Army Operations Center, it was kind of an eerie feeling to still, pick up on that odor that reminded, it almost took me back to 9/11. But I was selected in my second year there to go to be the senior speechwriter for the Chief of Staff of the Army, which was a guy named General Pete Schoonmaker, a guy who spent a lot of time in Special Forces, quite a guy, actually. And one of the really good things about that assignment, I had some exposure to him and wrote some of his important speeches that year. So that was good. But really, I think in particularly looking back, but even then I sort of appreciate his executive officer. Normally the executive officer to the chief is a former brigade commander colonel. And it was during Schoonmaker's time. And the guy that served in that position that year when I was his senior speechwriter was a guy named John Campbell. And John Campbell later went on to be promoted to 4-star, one of the great leaders in the Army at that moment, that came out of the 9/11 era and really just a superstar guy. And I worked with him both at Fort Hood, because even though he was a big airborne guy from Fort Bragg, his first assignment as a 1-star in the field was working as one of the assistant division commanders of the 1st Cavalry Division at Fort Hood, a heavy mech unit, which is kind of unusual. And we got to serve together in Iraq. So I leave that job and go down to Fort Hood, Texas, again for my second tour at Fort Hood to take command of the unit you mentioned earlier, Bill, the 89th Military Police Brigade, which was the brigade I had served in as a captain, as a young captain, And I remember talking to my captains, my first day, and I said, you guys probably not going to believe this, but, let me just tell you something. I was in your shoes at one point, back in 87, when you were in grade school. And at that point in history, I had no aspiration to be the brigade commander. I never thought I would be the brigade commander. I wasn't sure I was going to make major, And so, work hard, do your job, because you never know how things work out. And it was really special to me to get command of that brigade, not just any brigade, but to go back to where I'd served as a captain, go back to Fort Hood. My wife and I met at Fort Hood. We got married there. Our daughter was born at Fort Hood at Darnell Army Hospital. I fell in love there. So to go back as a colonel now and to take command of this brigade where I was one of many captains, it was a special experience. And we knew we were going to be, this was at a time, this was 05. I took that command in 05. So we were probably, 2 years into Operation Iraqi Freedom and 4 years at that point into Operation Noble Eagle, Operation Enduring Freedom in Afghanistan. But the way things were going, and I knew this from my time in the Army operation, at that point in history, the Fort Hood units were going to Iraq, not to Afghanistan. So it was only about time. I knew we were going to go to Iraq, and sure enough, a couple months after taking command in October of '05, we got our deployment order from U.S. Forces Command, and told us, hey, in August of '06, your brigade is required to be in Iraq.
I don't want to hijack what we're talking about. I'll preserve this for the entire thing. But here's the thing: I know why I know you now. I was a company commander in Mosul, Iraq, in 2006. I deployed October 13th, 2006, and I served under Colonel Mike Apodaca. But I was assigned.
Get out of here!
I was assigned to the first cab.
Okay.
And actually served under the 2-7 under sure. I can't remember. I remember the sergeant major.
2-7 was that? That wasn't McMaster, was it?
No, it was the sergeant major. There was Pippin, but I can't remember who the colonel was that was commanding the 2-7. Anyway, your name was on a lot of stuff that I read. In fact, you probably have signed some of the awards I have on my wall.
Very good. Very good.
So I this whole time I'm like,
wow, what a small world.
Absolutely. And Colonel Apodaca, what an amazing guy.
Great guy. I've known Apodaca since he was a second lieutenant. He was when I was on my first tour in Fort Hood as a senior, mid-level senior captain. Who did I meet on one of those days was young second lieutenant Mike Apodaca, and we bonded for whatever reason. I could just see he was a great up and coming guy. We stayed friends all those years, and I was so happy that when they built the force package for my brigade to deploy, that the way the 89th was set up, the Riley Battalion, he commanded the battalion for Riley. That was my former battalion. They were aligned in peacetime, not only in wartime, aligned under the 89th MP Brigade. We had training, what they call TRO, training and readiness oversight of that battalion. So, yeah, Mike had a small brigade. I mean, you look at the territory that he had, which was essentially Taji North, all the way up and to include the Kurdistan, provinces.
Erbil, he was all up in the
and the number of units. I mean, he had at one time, I think he had 12 MP companies. That's a brigade, And
do you know that he visited each one of those units every single month?
Oh, I know he did. I know. He and his son, Major Kevin Nolan, I thought were just great leaders. I mean,
Kevin and I are still friends. Like, I see him all the time now.
He's a great. I have him and I share the love of the Boston Red Sox. He's a Denver Bronco fan, which I'm not, but we're both Red Sox fans. And he's a good guy. He's a great leader, great non-commissioned officer. And I don't think we the brigade could have had two better leaders up there, because the deal. I always tell people to have a great unit, three things have to exist, and everyone typically maybe gets the first two, but no one gets the final one. So to me, you need a great commander. You're not going to have a great unit if you don't have a great commander. You might have a good unit, you might have a totally incompetent commander, but a great NCO, great first sergeant, great, command sergeant major. But if that commander is not great, you're not going to have a great unit, in my opinion. Second thing is you've got to have a great senior non-commissioned officer. If you're at the company level, or if you're at the platoon level, you got to have a great platoon sergeant. If you're at the company level, you got to have a great first sergeant. If you're at the battalion or higher, you got to have a great command sergeant major. So those are the two things, and then there's one more, and no one ever gets this. And I always give people a chance, and I say, no. You got to have good training. No, those two have to work together. In other words, you can have a great commander, you can have a great non-commissioned officer. But if they are not, together as one unified team, you will not have a great unit, And to me, no unit that I can think of right now, although I can think of other ones, epitomize that better than Nolan and Apodaca, because they were both individually great leaders, but they also really worked in unison together and supported each other.
And he took care of his people. So I deployed as a company commander as a first lieutenant.
Wow.
And I didn't make captain until 6 months after I got back from deployment.
Wow.
And I had 217 dudes and dudettes that I commanded there. But when you talk about that relationship between your senior non-com and your commander, that was myself and my first sergeant, Sergeant Burdan, I'll never forget him, is that we didn't agree on everything. But when we walked out of our offices, we had a unified command message.
Yeah, that's the whole thing. You don't want people to agree on everything at that level.
No.
You want that healthy tension. Hey, sir, I don't agree with you. You got to have that, But like you say, the professionalism is once that door, first of all, that disagreement is in a very close quarters, very small group of people that are aware of that, if any. And then once that door opens and you're out there, it's a unified team,
Absolutely.
I visited Mosul several times. My recollection, I could be wrong on this, is our battalion, our company commander in Mosul, if I recall, was a guy named Steve Bartley. Does that ring a bell? I think he was up Mosul. I don't know. I definitely went to Mosul several times, and I remember it was pretty hairy up there. I remember Apodaca arranged, because I would go out. I traveled mostly in the same way my soldiers did, in Humvees, 4 Humvees. I figured if I'm asking my soldiers to risk their life on the ground, I'm going to, and I tried to do that the whole time. And I remember Mike was like, hey, sir, this is pretty hairy up here. I said, well, it's pretty hairy everywhere I go, to be honest with you, Mike. But I appreciate that. But he arranged, without my knowledge, for 2 Apaches to fly over my convoy as we were traveling. And we actually were engaged. I had an IED incident in his sector. I don't think it was in Mosul, but it might have been. I forget. It wasn't officially. It was like right outside of Mosul. But yeah, we got hit. My element, the 4 vehicles, we got hit with an IED while we were up there, So yeah, well, that's such a small world, Bill, that you were there at the same time. That's really special, actually.
Yeah, so I think I relieved, the commander you're talking about is who I relieved when I came to Mosul. Because I got there in October, so I don't know when you were. It seems like I may have met you there as well, but you may remember.
You got there in October of 2006.
Yep, October. No, actually, yes, October of.
Well, we were there. I did not leave. We got, if you recall, I don't know if it affected you, but the brigade was extended 3 months. We were supposed to leave. Yeah, so I did. Me and the other soldiers in the headquarters of the brigade, my sergeant major and everybody, the staff, we did not leave until November of 2007. We were there.
You left the same time we left.
Wow.
I stepped off the battlefield on October 13th, but just prior to leaving, and you may remember this, just prior to leaving, I had been at a company commander meeting with Colonel Apodaca down in Tikrit. And when we were coming back, yes. And when we were coming back, we were on Route Hershey, and we got hit with the largest IED I have ever seen in my entire life.
It was probably an EFP. Probably wasn't an IED.
We thought it was, but they had just packed this culvert just full of holes. Anyway, we were fortunate that no one got hurt, but also we were able to video the entire thing. And I think First Army uses it now as a training tool. But I remember when that thing went off, looking in it, and I thought to myself, I didn't know they put a drawbridge on this road, because the entire road was up in front of my face, and it looked like a drawbridge had come off.
Wow.
But yeah,
if by chance you still have the link to that, send it to me. I'd like to look at it.
I will.
Have some difficult times, but
well, we lost. We had one of our squad leaders lose a leg while we were there. We sent. I made a promise to all of the families when I left that I would bring their soldiers home. I didn't realize what that promise meant. Yeah. Really, honestly, but I did. We brought everyone home as a group effort, but not everyone came home the way that they left, and that was really a tough one. But no,
we were there at the most difficult time of Operation Iraqi Freedom. It was an 8-year conflict. I guess the last part of that was Operation New Dawn, or OND. By then the force protection conditions had noticeably changed, and it was almost safe to be there. But we were there, you were there, I was there, up at Dr. Kevin Nolan, all those guys, my sergeant major. We were there at a very difficult time. We were there, slightly before and throughout the surge, and it was at a point in history which is why the surge occurred, because it was necessary. that Iraq was about to implode in a absolutely violent sectarian civil war that was just totally out of control. I mean, and all of our units, I mean, my sergeant major and I left the FOB and went outside the wire 6 days a week. So, but, you know, I was obviously getting updates every night, battle update briefs about 8 o'clock at night. I was monitoring throughout the day, even if something real, we were getting hit. Our units were getting hit all the time, constantly. I mean, all of our units, you know, some of them catastrophic and fatal, most of them not, but constant attacks during that period. I mean, and there's a histogram out there somewhere. I forget where I saw it, but I have seen it. I had it at one point. I don't know where it is, but it was basically looking at, you know what a histogram is, like a bar chart?
Absolutely, yes.
So there was a histogram that started in March of 03 when we invaded up until like, you know, October of 11, which was, you know, including the end of Operation New Dawn. And what it depicted was the number of attacks, daily attacks. And if you look at the period when you and I and Apodaca were there, it's like off the chart. I mean, it's like, you know, it's kind of constant. Then boom, you know, way, way up, you know, and then back down again. It was a horrible time. And that's why I think it was smart of General Petraeus and you know, Secretary of Defense at the time, Bob Gates, and the president to make the decision to deploy that extra division, you know, the surge, essentially, you know,
absolutely.
It did make a difference. It helped turn the tide of that war, because if they hadn't done that, I think, you know, it could have been that Baghdad collapsed and was taken over by, you know, bad guys, you know.
Oh yeah, I completely agree. In fact, I got to meet Jocko Willink, Navy SEAL commander. He's written books and runs a corporate training program now, and he was actually doing corporate training where I work. Anyway, I got to meet him, and he was there as part of the surge. And I remember as the surge was taking place, they were really pushing all of that up into the northern area. And so we got the benefit of, you know, being shot at.
Well, what had happened was, you know, if you look at Iraq prior to the surge, there was several places where you would refer to it as an economy of force operation. And part of that for sure was Baqaba, and that whole part of, you know, north of Iraq, north of Baghdad. There was basically a brigade that had an infantry brigade that had a very large sector that, you know, should have been a division, you know. So what you had areas that companies were trying to hold down that should have been battalions holding down. You had areas where brigades were assigned the sector, should have been a division, you know. And that was not only true in that, you know, Diyala province essentially, but it was also true in the south, you know, the Sunni Triangle down there. There were companies holding terrain. So what they ended up doing when they brought that extra division, the 3rd Infantry Division, they now could assign them a new sector. In fact, they came up with a new sector called MND-C, you know, Multinational Division Center or Central. And now you had a division in an area of responsibility, and you still had Multinational Division Baghdad. So you had 2 divisions where there had been one, and it just helped everything, you know, and really went after it in ways that they couldn't before because they didn't have the force structure to do it. So, but as we all knew who were there at the time, it was still a real difficult time, and it actually got worse before it got better, you know, as we went to more people being stationed outside, you know, with the operating posts that were outside the wire, and tough time. I actually thought it was great when they changed out and brought in Dave Petraeus to be the 4-star. I thought he you know, was the guy who led the surge. They changed out the MNCI commander from Pete Corelli, who I had served with in the Army Operations Center, to General Ray Odierno, you know, who had been there previously. So the guys that had been there early on, they had done a couple of tours there. You know, Casey had been there for 3 or 4 years. Corelli had been there as a division commander, then came back as a corps commander. And those guys, you know, they had done well under difficult conditions, but they were tired, you know. And so you brought back Petraeus, who had been there twice earlier, as a division commander in the 101st and as the Mensteki commander. So he had a good experience what was going on the ground, then came back as the 4-star. And Odierno had been there on the first phase of Iraqi freedom with the 4th Infantry Division. Now he's the Corps commander. And it was a really tough time to be an MP Brigade commander there. There were 2 MP Brigades there in Iraq when I was privileged to be there as the commander. And what they had done previously, was they divided the country in half. So you're the brigade commander in the north, everything involving MPs, you got everything in this. But by the time we deployed with the MP Brigade out of Fort Bragg, they decided not to do that. They decided to do it more functionally. So anything to do with the Iraqi police was our mission. Anything to do with detainee operations was the other brigade's mission. And of course, our mission necessitated to do it. You had to go outside the wire every day, you know. We also had
there was no choice.
You had no choice. And then therefore, when you go outside the wire, you're gonna get hit. You know, the detainee guys, I think, you know, they might have lost 2 or 3 soldiers the whole time frame that they were there, which every time you lose a soldier is, you know, significant and one too many. But we lost many more people than that. The other mission we had, which is kind of interesting and no one ever really knew about, but we took great pride in it, and it was really significant, was we had a security mission to provide security support not only to the senior U.S. commanders, so Petraeus and Odierno. We also had the mission to provide security support for the senior Iraqi leaders, to include al-Maliki, Talabani, and I forget the other guy's name, and for the U.S. ambassador, first Khalilzad and then Ryan Crocker. Now, just think about for a minute, now we were not the only ones in full transparency and disclosure. You know, in addition to us, there were other special operations units and contractors providing support for Admiral Crocker. We weren't the only people, but we did provide security for him when he was in movement. And just think about if Crocker had been assassinated then. Or think about it from the other side. Think about if al-Maliki, the prime minister of a new government, and think about if he had been assassinated during that time, or Talabani, or any, you know what I mean? So that was one of those missions I thought was a tactical mission assigned to the MP Brigade, but that had strategic implications. And no one really knew we had that mission, you know, other than very few people, you know. And
it goes back to the discussion that we had about the airplanes, right? All 9 of them land, but one of them crashes, right? So no one really thinks about this mission because it was so successful,
right?
But had it not been, we'd still be talking about it.
Well, exactly. I mean, if al-Maliki was killed during that time frame, or Ray Odierno or Dave Petraeus or any of those guys were assassinated, you know, I mean, at some point you start to get in, well, who was guarding them? And, you know, yeah. So, but I was so proud of the soldiers. We had 4 battalions in it at its peak. The 89th MP Brigade exercised command and control over 4 military police battalions. Mike Apodaca's battalion out of Fort Riley, Lieutenant Colonel Frank Rangel and Command Sergeant Major Drew Craig had the 720th MP Battalion out of Fort Hood, Texas. Both of those guys had been over there before, so it was helpful that they had that experience. We had the 793rd. I'm having a brain cramp as far as the battalion, 759th Military Police Battalion out of Fort Carson, Colorado. And then we had the 92nd MP Battalion out of Fort Benning, Georgia. And so they were dispersed, you know. Apodaca had the north. Frank Rangel's battalion had mostly the south part, Sunni Triangle, almost all the way down to Basra, but not, you know, but everything down there in the southern part, Iskandria and, you know, Najaf and really all that area south of Baghdad. And then the other 2 battalions, one had East Baghdad, the 759th, and the 92nd out of Benning had West Baghdad and Al Anbar province out into the, you know, with the Marine sector. We actually had MPs from the brigade supporting multiple different maneuver brigade commanders, Army, and in Al Anbar province, we were actually supporting Marine regimental commanders, you know. So right. we at its peak, the brigade had just shy of 5,000 soldiers, you know, over there. And as you know, people coming and going all the time. You're rotating units through all the time. quite. What I was really proud of, and it was a unique thing, was it was the first time that the 89th MP Brigade had been deployed in a combat theater where it had its organic MP battalions in peacetime aligned under the brigade in wartime. That's something I always had tried to achieve when I was a young captain back at Hood. I was always trying to, create the conditions, because it makes a difference when you've trained with people in peacetime. Now you're in war with them, So it was the first, and to the best of my knowledge, it hasn't happened since. The last time we had that happen was in Vietnam. Right after the 89th MP Brigade was formed in Vietnam in '66. And I think at some point during the Vietnam conflict, the brigade actually had command and control over its organic MP battalion. All those years in between, it never happened until our rotation 0608.
Makes a big difference. You're right, because they understand command philosophy. They understand each other.
Yeah.
There's all those synergies that you develop.
Incredible team. And I was blessed, and the brigade was blessed. We had the brigade command sergeant major was a guy named Mike Sampson, who was my battle buddy. I honestly could not have had a finer brigade command sergeant major, and more importantly, the brigade could have not had a finer brigade sergeant major. That man, he was just absolutely incredible. And we had the privilege of, so when I took the colors of the 89th MP Brigade, the first thing that happens is the old commander turns it over to his sergeant major. Then that sergeant major turns it over to the general. Then the general turns it over to me, the new brigade command sergeant major, and then I give it back to the sergeant major. Well, what happened was the command sergeant major before Mike Sampson, he was past his mandatory retirement. He was retiring. Bottom line, he was retiring. He was leaving. He was a great guy, Charlie Guyette, but he was leaving. So Charlie Guyette, who had served with the outgoing brigade commander, handed the colors to his brigade commander, who he had deployed with. He gave it to the general. The general gave it to me. And by the time I was giving it to the sergeant major, it was Mike Sampson. So from the very first ceremony where I became the commander, he became the CSM. And we did that exact same thing when I left. So he and I were together, our complete tour, which was 29 months together, almost 30 months together. And I tell you, I mean it to this day. I get emotional talking about him because I love the guy so much. Just a superb command sergeant major. Just superb. The soldiers loved him. No one cared more about soldiers. He risked his life constantly going outside the wire to check on his troops. And I told him, and I've said this publicly before, and it's true. That guy didn't ever give me bad advice. Not once. 29 months serving together, peacetime, combat. And I just didn't, he was involved with everything. He's a very smart guy, so I didn't just align or assign to him traditional quote NCO. I don't think like that about my NCOs. My attitude is this guy is a warrior. He's got tremendous operational experience. He's got tremendous experience in life in general. So anything important that involved that brigade, I wanted Mike Sampson's opinion. So I was constantly going to him for his advice on every imaginable topic, operations, training. Once we were deployed downrange, IP, and all that time, he never once gave me bad advice. And we also were blessed with, in addition to great battalion commanders and battalion CSMs and a great CSM, I had two guys on my staff were deputies. And at that time in history, the MP Corps assigned the brigades two deputies. We normally only authorize one lieutenant colonel, but because they wanted to build a bench of lieutenant colonels that had wartime deployment experience so that if they got selected for a brigade command, we had two. So I had a guy named Jeff Davies, who had been a battalion commander, and Gary Milner, who had been a battalion commander. Two different guys in terms of their personality, both great soldiers, smart guys. And so, my attitude is like, how couldn't I be successful surrounded by this quality? And I mean that, these guys were, you talk about top-notch people, selfless, humble, team players, competent. And those two deputies went outside the wire all the time. And I never told them to. I never told Sampson to go outside the wire. I didn't have to. He was like a horse, at the start gate, ready for the gate to lift. He was going outside the wire. There was no way. But these two deputies officially, based on the nature of their duties, there was not a requirement that they go outside the wire. And I never told them to. And they were outside the wire all the time, exposing themselves to the same risk that the soldiers were. And the soldiers saw that. They saw their leaders, their brigade commander, the brigade CSM, the two deputies, So it was quite an experience. When I came back from that deployment, I ended up getting back in public affairs. And quite frankly, at that point in history, I was a pretty senior guy, former brigade commander, and I ended up working in public affairs. And I remember calling General Corelli one day and asking him if he would preside at my retirement ceremony. He's like, retirement? Yeah, what are you doing? And I was like, sir, I'm coming up on 30 years. This will be 30 years. I've had the privilege of commanding a brigade in combat for 15 months. I'm still married to the same woman I'm married to all these years, which at that time was 30 years. I've got two wonderful kids that still love me. My dog still loves me. I'm basically healthy. I used to tell people when I got back from Iraq, "Oh, Mike, it's nice to see you safe and sound." I was like, "I'm safe. I'm not sure how sound I am, but I was always, and it's like I don't have anything more to do in the Army." Now, when I retired at the ceremony, General Corelli did agree, and he presided at my retirement ceremony. As I was standing there and listening to all the lies being told about me and all the inflationary comments, all the hyperbole, I was reflecting as like two things entered my mind. Like, one is, boy, how fast did this go? I mean, am I really retiring? I mean, it's like I don't feel that way. I still felt pretty young and energetic, and that I had more to give. But at the same time, there was a sense of it's time. It's like you've been blessed with so many opportunities, so many good things have happened to you. It's time to give someone else a chance, because the way the military works, as particularly as you get more senior, if you're there, that's one less person that can be promoted to that rank. If you're a colonel, if you're a brigadier, whatever rank you are at that level, there's not as many of them at that level as there are second lieutenants. And if you're still serving, you're preventing someone from filling, to get that opportunity. And I was very mindful of that, so I was like, I feel good, and it was a good time to go. And I left the military with my head high, knowing that I really had done everything in my career that I had wanted to. And, a couple of people reached out, well, you maybe think about, maybe you could get, my attitude is like, I've never chased promotion. I'm the same guy who wrote letters to 2-stars as a second lieutenant. I'm the same guy who challenged in 06 as a first lieutenant. I've never really sought to be that, I always pride myself on politically astute, obviously having worked with a lot of senior officers, and I understand politics but at the same time, I've always sort of let my heart and my soul guide me, not I've never pursued rank. I never have, And so I wasn't about to start at that point in my career. And I really felt blessed to have all the opportunities I had. And it was time. So in early June 2010, I walked away, they did a nice ceremony for me at the Pentagon. And that's it. That kind of culminated, starting with the commissioning on the deck of the USS Constitution in June of 1980 as a brand new green second lieutenant with nothing on my chest, to retiring, 30 years later at the Pentagon after serving multiple tours in the Pentagon, experiencing 9/11, living in Korea twice, 3 years. I mean, I had over 8 years overseas, having the privilege of commanding a brigade. I just felt like it was a good time to leave. And I've never looked back, and I'm forever proud of my service. Still keep in touch with many of the men and women I serve with in the military. They're now 06s and 05s or CSMs, The one way I've stayed connected, I've tried to stay connected, is I don't ever turn down an invite. So if someone invites me to preside at their promotion to 05 or 06, I'll go. If someone invites me to speak at their retirement, I'll go. And obviously at this point, when I do that, that's on my dime, And I've gone to countless ceremonies. I've seen my captains that were company commanders for me get promoted to colonel. I've, in many cases, presided at those ceremonies. I spoke at Mike Apodaca's retirement ceremony. I spoke at Jeff Davies' retirement ceremony. My S3 recently retired as a full colonel down at Fort Monroe, Virginia. I did that virtually because it was still COVID protocol, so they didn't want people there. But I spoke like you and I are spoken now on Zoom at his retirement. And I still periodically get texts and calls from people seeking my counsel, Sir, what do you think? I'm proud of that, because I think what that displays is people know they can trust me, because the more senior you get, you're not really sure what to share with people, and no matter what rank you are, you have, you reach a fork in the road. Do I do this? Do I do that? Who should I talk to? Who can I trust? So I'm proud of the fact I've maintained contact with the next generation of leaders. And then I went to work for VA for 11 years. And now I'm a senior consultant. I'm retired from federal service, ended up with just shy of 41 years of total service to our country in uniform and as a senior executive. Had a great experience at VA working with some wonderful human beings in different locations and different capacities. And now I'm a senior consultant, and I'm working closely with what's called the Gates Global Policy Center, which is run by former Secretary of Defense Bob Gates, and who is the president of Gates Global, but none other than General retired Peter Corelli, who was the guy I was standing next to in the Army Operations Center, and also the guy I served with in Iraq when I was a brigade commander. He was the multinational Corps Iraq commander. So it's a small world, and still motivated, still work out, still love life, love people, and keep myself in shape as best I can at my age, because you never know when we might have to step back into the breach. And I'm mentally ready to do that. And I try to keep myself physically ready to do that. Although, as you know, as you get older, the physical part becomes more difficult. But I think being a soldier is also a lot about mentally, having that mental discipline and toughness. And I definitely still have that.
Well, so all of that is a great segue to kind of the final question I have to ask you. First of all, it was such a pleasure to serve under your command.
Well, that means a lot, Bill, that you're saying that, man.
In all honesty, it's an honor to talk to you in this way and really know who you are. So I appreciate you taking the time to do that. But you've had a long career. I hear a lot of things in there. It's about relationships. It's about trusting people. It's about gaining people's trust. So the idea behind what we're doing is that this will be listened to years from now when both you and I aren't here anymore. Right. And hopefully this will be some great learning for people, not only people who want to read about history, who want to hear it from the words and the mouths of the people who lived it. I say all of that to ask this final question, and that is, when someone listens to this 50 years from now, what message do you want to leave them with?
Well, that's a deep question, and I'll try to do it justice. I mean, I believe in the notion of service is one thing. I mean, this is going to be probably a convoluted answer, but there'll be some themes that emerge from it. I believe it's very important that everyone in our society have principles that guide them throughout their life. For me, I have always referred to that as what I call 3 F's and a C. And I tell people when I say that publicly, I say, for some of you, that might have been a good report card. Hell, maybe for me, it might have been a good report card at one point in life. But the 3 F's, sort of my principles, my underpinnings that have guided me as an adult is faith, family, friends, and country. And so I'm not going to go into all those details. And obviously not everyone has faith. For me, it is work that I have faith. It has, given me strength where I might otherwise be lacking. You can't underestimate enough, to me in my life, the importance of family. I've always been blessed with superb role models in my family, starting with my own parents, my aunts and uncles, my siblings, my cousins, my own family. Now, since I've been married and had kids, my wife is, herself is a great person, a great soldier herself. She served on active duty for 22 years, almost 22 years. Our kids, I mean, you draw strength from your family, and they're there for you. And they're really the people who will always be there for you, good, bad, and ugly times, So family, can't ever underestimate that. I've been blessed throughout my life. I always used to hear, well, first of all, as a kid, I remember hearing the distinction from my dad of, well, there's a friend and then there's an acquaintance. Make sure you know the difference between the two. And then there's even professional colleague that might not even be, so there's levels of people that enter your life that are not family. make sure you think through who you call your friend and make sure you hold that to the highest standard. And part of that was like, you'll be lucky if you have 3 good friends in your life. And that's probably true for most people. I've been blessed for a variety of reasons, part of my choice of profession. But I mean, I have friends that I still keep in touch with regularly, not like once every 10 years, that I went to high school with, people that I've known since grade school, 50 plus years. I've known these kids, met them in 3rd grade, and we're still close, and we still see each other about every year, 50 plus years later. I made friends in the Army. I talked to you about my first company commander, Bruce Ulrichson. He's like a brother to me. He lives in New Hampshire with his wife. We're going there to see them this summer. We've gone to see them probably every other year, like it averages out to be every other year for the last 25 years, almost since I met him. There's other friends that I serve with. I got a buddy of mine named Tom McGrath. He's a guy from South Boston who is a former retired Army officer, worked at the VA too. Him and I converse. So, and the list goes on. I just am blessed with lots of really good friends, and it's a lot more than 3. And I don't take them for granted. Tons of them. Dave Smith is a retired MP colonel that lives in Northern Virginia with his wife, Donna. We've known each other since command and staff college, 25 years. We keep in touch. So family, faith, friends, and then the country part of to me is service. When I grew up, I told you earlier in this segment, every man that I respected has served in the military. So for me, I don't know if it was, a gradual assimilation, I never thought that I wasn't going to serve in the military. To the contrary, I knew I was going to serve. I just didn't know which service initially, or when, or how, or what circumstances were going to take me there. But there was never a doubt. So to me, the theme of service is very important. And I truly believe every American should give something back to our country. And if they can't, for whatever reason, serve in the military, they should find some other way they can serve at the local, state, city, federal level. They need to give something back, because I think a lot of people in our country find fault with our country, and they just take our country for granted, and having served 8.5 years overseas, including in a combat zone for 15 months, look, I acknowledge we have issues in our country. We have problems in our country, but our country, in my mind, and I'm not just saying this because I've drank the Kool-Aid or brainwashed, there is not another country on the earth that is as good as our country, that takes care of its people in the same way, or that does what we've done for other countries throughout history to help them have a better life. How many American service members have died overseas in faraway lands doing something that really is benefiting that country, probably in many regards more so than our country. So the whole thing of service. As the other component for me is, it gets back to what I said earlier about all of us are smarter than any of us. Anyone, no matter how individually talented they are, you're not going to accomplish anything if you're a megalomaniac or if it's all about you. People just don't respond to that. I think the early and really almost lifelong participation in sports has been very impactful to me. And I always tell young kids that are playing sports, look, regardless if you ever make it to the NBA or the NFL, because statistically very few of you will do that, if any, sports teaches you many things. And particularly if it's a team sport, it teaches you the importance of teamwork, of never quitting, self-discipline, fitting into it's not about you, it's about your team success. And I remember as a first lieutenant, I had this experience where I actually, without going into any detail, I remember taking off my rank as a captain, very young captain, putting on E2 stripes, and I went to this little school that they ran over in Bad Tölz, Germany. And the only way I could go there as an enlisted man. And I had a great battalion commander who supported my craziness at the time. And, sir, I want to go to this course. And he says, well, how are you going to do that? I said, well, you don't need to know the details, but I will be enlisted man when I go there. And I put on each. Anyway, at some point, the lieutenant, I was assigned to an infantry platoon from Baumholder, and I was training with them. And they had a lieutenant who was, an academy grad, really highly decorated already as a lieutenant, not decorated with, badges and medals, not heroism, just, schooling, basically. Individually, he was extremely competent, but he had not earned the respect of his non-commissioned officers. And his platoon totally underperformed. And I remember by the time this course ended, somehow, and I had not told anyone, but I think the cadre knew, and somehow it leaked out that I'm a captain. So I remember at the end of the course, the first lieutenant looks me in the eyes. He's coming around shaking all of his platoon leaders' platoon's hands, and I'm still part of the platoon. Looks at me, and he was kind of like, "Oh, I don't know whether to call you." So and I said, "Look, there's no apologies needed. You did fine. You're going to do well, but you got to remember, your individual competence doesn't matter. It only matters in the broader picture is if you can leverage your individual competence to help this platoon perform at a high level. If you can't do that, you have failed as a leader." And so that's part of the thing that I take away is that, leadership is a privilege. And if you're entrusted with the privilege of leading people at any level, in the military or outside the military, it's not about you. Your value as a leader is dependent on how that unit or that organization performs. Doesn't matter how many degrees you have, what schools you went. That doesn't matter if you can't effectively motivate, inspire, and get other people to perform at a higher level. If you can't do that, you failed as a leader, So, and the other thing I think in life as a guy who's, now approaching my mid-60s is you got to look at life as sort of a marathon, not a sprint. In other words, give it your all, but have the long vision. If you go too hard in the first quarter of a game, you might not be physically able to still excel in the fourth quarter. If you extrapolate that sort of game metaphor to life, if you go so hard early in your life that for whatever reason, mentally, emotionally, physically, you're not able to continue to stay at that level, So I always like to think of things in what I call the band of excellence. I didn't come up with that. Someone else did. I probably read a book years ago, but it's the band of excellence. In other words, you can't always be at the 100th percentile, but what you can be is you can establish that I'm always going to be within this band of excellence. And that band of excellence is somewhere between the 90th and the 100th percentile. In other words, you're always going to get an A- or above, You're not going to accept lower than that. But if you're always striving to be perfect, you're probably going to drive yourself crazy. And if you're a leader, you're probably going to drive your people crazy. Another thing is there's lots of different ways to accomplish the same mission, be it in the military the military environment or the private sector. To me, a leader's job is to establish a healthy organization command climate. And that climate should be one that emphasizes integrity, ethics, treating other people always with dignity and respect, and giving it your best. Don't accept a mediocre, give it your best, and work within a team. And once you establish that organization climate, recognize that if Bill Krieger is given the same mission I am, you might do it differently. You were raised in a different state. You had different parents. You had different schooling. That's okay, But as long as you stay within the range fan of ethics, integrity, treating everyone properly, it's okay that you do it differently. Get the mission done. Do it correctly. Too many leaders become a single point of failure. Everything has to come to them before it gets done. Get past that. Delegate. Have faith in your people. They'll respond to it, and recognize that most people want to do a good job. I remember Gary Luck, the former four-star, used to ask people, "Hey, how many guys in here came to fail? How many guys joined the Army because you wanted to fail? Raise your hand." Of course, nobody raised their hand, Everybody's motivated. Everybody wants to do well, right? And if there's a few that don't, you identify them and they stand out like sore thumbs, Give people that respect. And, the other thing that people always forget about is have fun. I was a lieutenant colonel at the pre-command course, and they wanted you to write your command philosophy. Mine were bullets, and the last bullet was have fun. And this old lieutenant colonel comes and said, "Well, where's your command philosophy, Mike? How can you be done so soon?" I said, "Well, I'm done, sir. It's 5 bullets." Well, we were looking for more than that. I said, "Well, I can write, sir. It's not that I can't write." It said, No one's going to read it if I have this 3-page command philosophy. This is what I believe in. So he looks at it and he said, what's this? And he's pointing to the last bullet. It's have fun. I said, do you have a problem reading that, sir? It's just 2 words, sir. Have fun, And he goes, yeah, I know what it is, but I mean, how can that be part? Why is that? I said, I believe it, sir. The military, we work hard. We work long hours. We're together a long time. There's a lot of strain and stress, and that's in peacetime. You go into a wartime environment, it's a whole thing. And I said, have fun is who I am as a life. There's a time and place. It's not every time. It's not every place. But people need to know they can laugh. People need to know they can relax. People need to know they can let their hair down. And so I would say, live by whatever principles work for you. Mine are the 3 F's of C. Do your best, trust people, and have fun. And I think if you can do that, you're going to have a pretty good life no matter what you choose to do. And I believe it's going to be successful in the military because it worked for me.
Thank you for listening to another episode of Veterans Archives, the podcast that brings you the story of the men and women who have created and lived our military history. If you or someone you know served in the military and would like to share your story with Veterans Archives, please go to www.veteransarchives.org, select the Apply Now button, and fill out our application, and someone will get right back with you. Veterans Archives is a 501c3 nonprofit organization, and we rely on the donations of our listeners. If you are enjoying these stories and you support our efforts, please go to www.veteransarchives.org and select the Donate button. Any donation is certainly appreciated. Look for Veterans Archives on your favorite social media. We are on LinkedIn, Instagram, and Facebook. Just look for Veterans Archives. Like, follow, and share our page. We'd certainly appreciate it. If you or someone you know is a veteran and you are struggling with mental health issues, please dial 988 and select option 1 for the Veterans Crisis Hotline. Please be sure to tune in next time for the next episode of Veterans Archives.